intense psychological study of people, objects, and their surroundings, coupled with an earnest Christian devotion, fueled Rembrandt's life and work. Incredibly gifted as an artist from a very young age, he became a master of portraits of all types: historical, biblical, and mythological scenes, as well as simple, charming, but dramatic landscapes. He used many types of materials and techniques with unusual sensitivity and spontaneity to develop his message. His approaches to composition, color usage, and shadow were ever-changing to produce the most powerfully moving but most natural moments of human existence. His supreme mastery of light and texture to emphasize emotional depth weaved a common theme through all of his creations, cementing his status as one of art's greatest innovative masters. These qualities are evident from his large, ambitious early history paintings to his more intimate and glowing later style. The iconic genius is generally regarded as the most important artist in Dutch art history, as his work epitomized the great period of wealth and cultural achievement known as the Dutch Golden Age. Rembrandt van Rijn was the eighth of 9 or more children born to Harmen van Rijn, a corn miller, and Cornelia van Zuidbroek, a baker's daughter. The prosperous family lived in Leiden near the Rhine River, originally called the Van Rijn River, and dedicated themselves to religion and education. Cornelia often read the scriptures to her children, which provided a strong sense of God, man, and nature for the young and profoundly Christian Rembrandt. Rembrandt's parents recognized his talents as a young child, so they sent him, from age 7 to 14, to the Latin school in Leiden for a classical education. He received the best education that an academic city in Holland could provide for a child with a deep interest in literature and scripture. He was duly prepared for admission to the University of Leiden, a fine institution. He entered the university as Rembrandtus Hermanni Leidenis and signed early paintings as RHL, but after a few months he withdrew to dedicate himself to art. Rembrandt secured a 3-year apprenticeship with Jacob Swanenberg, who taught him the fundamentals of painting, drawing, and etching. When he was still in his teens, his father sent him to Amsterdam to study with Peter Lastman, a skilled Italian painter of historical scenes. Lastman had studied the works of Caravaggio and Eisheimer, a German painter living in Rome. After several months, Rembrandt had mastered the techniques of chiaroscuro as well as the use of bright, glossy colors and posing figures with theatrical gestures. Lastman also influenced Rembrandt to concentrate on historical and religious scenes, although the local art buyers preferred scenes from their daily lives. As Paul Nemo quoted in his 1975 Rembrandt drawings, the young Rembrandt felt strongly about his subjects, saying, "Painting is the grandchild of nature. It is related to God." At the age of 18 or 19, Rembrandt returned to Leiden to set up his own studio. He looked more refined, dressed well, and worked closely with a student 6 years younger, Jan Lievens, who had also studied under Lastman. Rembrandt began his artistic journey with a remarkable display of talent and originality. Among his earliest known surviving works is The Senses, a series of 5 oil paintings created around 1624 or 1625, when the artist was only about 18 or 19 years old. This series, comprising allegorical depictions of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, not only reveals Rembrandt's emerging technical skills, but also offers an early glimpse into his lifelong fascination with the human condition, emotion, and realism. Each painting in the senses represents one of the 5 human faculties through vivid genre scenes rather than abstract personifications. The titles assigned to the works in modern scholarship are A Peddler Selling Spectacles, Sight, 3 Singers, Hearing, Unconscious Patient, Allegory of Smell, The Operation, Allegory of Touch, and a now-lost work presumed to have depicted taste. Despite their small-scale and youthful execution, these paintings demonstrate the young Rembrandt's developing mastery in composition, character portrayal, and psychological nuance. In A Peddler Selling Spectacles, a man attempts to place eyeglasses onto an elderly woman, symbolizing the restoration or perhaps imposition of vision. The gesture may suggest a broader allegory, the idea of seeing clearly as a metaphor for wisdom or enlightenment. Meanwhile, 3 Singers presents a group of expressive figures mid-song, their animated faces and open mouths capturing the auditory experience of music and the social nature of hearing. Unconscious Patient, also known as the Allegory of Smell, is perhaps the most dynamic and dramatic of the group. It depicts a man being revived with smelling salts, his unconscious state broken by the pungent stimulant. The scene is visceral and immediate, emphasizing smell as a physical, almost violent sensory force. Similarly, The Operation, representing touch, shows a medical procedure being performed a moment both intimate and uncomfortable, grounding the sense of touch in pain, precision, and corporeal reality. Though the painting for taste is now lost, scholars have speculated about its content based on the thematic consistency of the others. It likely featured a scene involving eating or drinking, rendered with the same earthy realism that characterizes the rest of the series. Stylistically, these works prefigure many of Rembrandt's mature characteristics. While the lighting is relatively even compared to his later dramatic Chiaroscuro, the focus on facial expression, human interaction, and narrative clarity is already present. The compositions are simple but effective, often centering the action closely and eliminating distractions. This approach reflects Rembrandt's early interest in Troni's studies of expressive faces that would continue throughout his career. Moreover, the Senses series provides valuable insight into the cultural and artistic environment of early 17th century Leiden. Genre scenes and allegorical subjects were popular among middle-class Dutch patrons, who favored art that was relatable and morally instructive. Rembrandt's choice to render the senses through common folk rather than mythological or idealized figures aligns with this preference and reveals his ability to respond to market demand without compromising creative vision. The Senses stands as a crucial milestone in Rembrandt's artistic development. These paintings, though created at the dawn of his career, already contain the seeds of his future greatness: a sensitivity to human emotion, a commitment to realism, and a boldness in concept. They mark the awakening of a genius whose work would forever change the course of Western art. The stoning of St. Stephen marks the official beginning of Rembrandt van Rijn's artistic career. Completed in 1625, when the Dutch painter was only 19 years old, it is widely regarded as his first signed work, and it offers a compelling glimpse into the genius that would later define one of the most influential painters in Western art. Executed in oil on a wooden panel and currently housed in the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Lyon, the painting represents both a religious meditation and a technical exercise. Drawing inspiration from biblical text, contemporary art influences, and Rembrandt's emerging visual language. This work is inspired by the martyrdom of Saint Stephen, the first Christian martyr as recounted in Acts 7:54-60. A young deacon in the early Christian community of Jerusalem, Stephen was condemned to death by stoning after being accused of blasphemy. Rembrandt chose to represent the precise moment when Stephen, dragged outside the city by his accusers, is being stoned by a crowd of roughly 20 figures. As he suffers the assault, Stephen utters his final words to Christ, and Rembrandt dramatizes this divine communication through a striking use of light. A celestial radiance surrounds the martyr, suggesting the heavens have opened above him. The scene encapsulates the tension between earthly brutality and spiritual transcendence, a dichotomy that would preoccupy Rembrandt throughout his career. The composition reflects the young artist's awareness of contemporary artistic influences, particularly the dramatic realism of Caravaggio and the refined narrative clarity of Adam Elsheimer. These influences are visible in both the painting's structure and its lighting. The scene is divided into two distinct zones, separated by a diagonal composition that creates a strong chiaroscuro effect. On the left, a man on horseback is cloaked in shadow, while on the right, St. Stephen and his assailants are bathed in bright light. This interplay between darkness and illumination not only guides the viewer's eye, but also reinforces the spiritual symbolism at the heart of the work. The light surrounding Stephen affirms his sanctity and links the physical violence of martyrdom with the promise of divine salvation. In the background sits Saul of Tarsus, later known as St. Paul, calmly observing the execution while holding the garments of the stoners. This faithful biblical detail is layered into the narrative, emphasizing both the historical moment and the transformative journey Saul would eventually undergo. While the composition is ambitious, it also reveals signs of Rembrandt's youth. Drawing inaccuracies are visible in certain areas, including some distortions in anatomy and perspective. However, these technical imperfections are overshadowed by the painting's emotional intensity and narrative complexity. A particularly notable element of the painting is Rembrandt's early exploration of self-portraiture. Scholars have identified up to 7 variations of his own face embedded within the crowd of figures, an unusually introspective choice for such a young artist. One figure, located just behind Stephen, appears to be a self-portrait, rendered within the larger composition much like Diego Velázquez would later do in Las Meninas. Biblical scholar John Durham suggests that Rembrandt presents himself here as a somewhat alarmed presence, a participant who may be having second thoughts about what was taking place. This interpretation positions the artist not merely as an observer, but as a moral witness, uncertain of his role in the unfolding violence. By inserting himself into the scene multiple times, Rembrandt confronts the ethical weight of martyrdom and human cruelty, suggesting a profound personal engagement with the subject. Stylistically, The stoning of St. Stephen showcases many of the themes and methods that would become central to Rembrandt's later work. His use of expressive facial detail, dramatic lighting, and theatrical composition all point to an evolving mastery of visual storytelling. More importantly, the painting highlights his preoccupation with the psychological and spiritual dimensions of his subjects, a trait that would come to define his mature religious works. The stoning of St. Stephen is far more than a student exercise or early experiment. It is a deeply ambitious, emotionally charged work that marks the beginning of Rembrandt's career with powerful themes of faith, violence, moral conflict, and divine grace. Drawing on the artistic traditions of Caravaggio and Elsheimer while laying the groundwork for his own unique voice, Rembrandt used this biblical narrative not only to showcase his emerging skills, but also to insert himself both literally and spiritually into the great moral and existential questions of his time. Among the earliest religious paintings attributed to Rembrandt van Rijn, Let the Little Children Come to Me, also known as Suffer the Little Children to Come unto Me, stands out as a poignant reflection on divine compassion and human innocence. Believed to have been painted in Leiden during the 1620s, this work reflects Rembrandt's formative years, when he was still developing his technical vocabulary and narrative style. Though the attribution remains debated, the painting reveals many characteristics of the young Rembrandt's vision, particularly his psychological sensitivity, narrative clarity, and deep moral imagination. The painting is inspired by a passage from the Gospel of Mark 10:13-16, in which Jesus, when the disciples attempt to turn children away, commands, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these." This scene affirms the spiritual value of innocence and childlike trust. Rembrandt, or the artist to whom this work is attributed, renders this moment not as a lofty, celestial event, but as a scene grounded in human warmth and accessibility. Christ is typically depicted seated at the center, extending a blessing to a group of small children, while mothers, followers, and onlookers gather around. The emotional core of the painting lies not in grandeur, but in tender interaction. A child reaching out, a mother offering her infant, Jesus welcoming them with gentle eyes and outstretched hands. The theological message is translated into visual language that invites empathy. The painting's composition is intimate and compact, with closely grouped figures filling the frame. This choice not only reflects Rembrandt's early style during his Leiden period, but also enhances the sense of emotional closeness. The lighting is soft and warm, lacking the bold chiaroscuro of his later works, but still subtly guiding the viewer's eye toward the central figure of Christ and the children. The palette leans toward earthy tones, reinforcing the naturalism that would later become one of Rembrandt's trademarks. One of the distinctive traits of this painting, if it is indeed by Rembrandt, is its genre-like realism. The figures are dressed in contemporary 17th century clothing, grounding the sacred story within familiar, everyday imagery. This technique aligns with the Protestant artistic culture of the Dutch Republic, which favored personal piety and accessible representations of biblical scenes over grandiose iconography. Even in this early phase, the artist displays a remarkable command of emotional nuance. Jesus is not portrayed as an aloof divine authority, but rather as a deeply human presence kind, approachable, attentive. His facial expression exudes empathy, while the varied reactions of the surrounding figures' curiosity, reverence, hesitation add to the painting's psychological complexity. This attention to human emotion is one of the defining characteristics of Rembrandt's oeuvre. In works such as The Return of the Prodigal Son or The Raising of Lazarus, he would later explore the full spectrum of spiritual and emotional transformation. Let the Little Children Come to Me appears to anticipate this trajectory, revealing a young artist already attuned to the inner lives of his subjects. Painted during the artist's early Leiden years, this work shows clear evidence of influence from his teacher Peter Lastman, especially in the narrative organization and classical posturing of some figures. Yet it also departs from Lastman's more theatrical style in favor of greater emotional realism and restraint. Furthermore, the painting's theme, Christ embracing society's most vulnerable, aligns with one of Rembrandt's lifelong concerns: the dignity of the marginalized. In later decades, he would return to similar subjects: beggars, elderly people, or biblical figures in moments of weakness or grace. In that sense, Let the Little Children Come to Me serves as a quiet thematic foundation for much of what was to come. Though some scholars question whether the painting is truly by Rembrandt, others point to its stylistic affinities, particularly in facial modeling and composition, as evidence of his hand. If not by Rembrandt himself, it likely emerged from his close circle, reflecting shared values and approaches in early 17th century Dutch religious art. Let the Little Children Come to Me is a work of subtle power and enduring relevance. Whether definitively by Rembrandt or not, the painting embodies the values he would later champion: intimacy, empathy, and spiritual humanity. It turns a moment of scripture into a scene of everyday grace, where divine love is made visible through human gesture and connection. As such, it marks an important step in the evolution of one of the most compassionate and perceptive artists in the history of Western painting. History painting, completed in 1626, is one of Rembrandt's earliest known works, executed when he was just 20 years old. Painted in Leiden, the work reflects the young artist's early ambition to position himself among the most intellectually and artistically elite genres of painting, that of history painting, which in the hierarchy of genres stood above landscape, portraiture, and still life due to its moral, narrative, and often spiritual gravitas. Yet the very title of this work, history painting, reveals a fundamental mystery. The subject matter remains unidentified, and art historians have long debated what scene the young Rembrandt intended to portray. Over a dozen hypotheses have been proposed, ranging from biblical episodes to classical antiquity and modern history. According to the art historian Gary Schwartz, one of the most compelling interpretations is Palamedes before Agamemnon, a tragic scene from the Trojan War. In this story, Palamedes is falsely accused of treason by Odysseus, and Agamemnon, persuaded by forged evidence, orders him executed by stoning. If this interpretation is correct, the painting can be read as a powerful exploration of injustice, political intrigue, and the fragility of truth. These themes would later reappear in Rembrandt's mature biblical works, indicating a thematic through-line from his early career. The dramatic intensity of the scene, with figures captured mid-motion and faces contorted in tension or grief, demonstrates Rembrandt's budding skill in drama, narrative composition, and emotional realism. Visually, the painting is notable for its dense grouping of figures and complex theatrical staging, a feature influenced by the contemporaneous work of Caravaggio and Adam Elsheimer. The use of chiaroscuro, though not yet as refined as in his later masterpieces, is already evident. Light focuses on the central figures, casting moral and visual weight upon them, while the periphery recedes into shadow. This technique not only adds depth and movement, but also guides the viewer's gaze and emotional engagement with the scene. Another noteworthy element is Rembrandt's use of costume and gesture, which reflects a deliberate attempt to evoke antiquity without relying on archaeological accuracy. The clothing is eclectic, blending elements from Renaissance, classical, and even contemporary Dutch fashion, a typical feature of early 17th century history painting that prioritized dramatic effect over historical precision. Although some technical inconsistencies remain, such as in anatomy and spatial coherence, they are understandable for a work completed during Rembrandt's formative years. What stands out is his boldness in tackling a large, multi-figure narrative composition, a sign of his aspiration to rival the great masters of his time. History painting is less about a single confirmed story and more about Rembrandt's first major engagement with storytelling through paint. The ambiguity of its subject challenges viewers to engage not only with what they see, but with how meaning is constructed in art. Whether or not the scene is truly Palamedes before Agamemnon, the painting foreshadows the moral complexity, psychological intensity, and dramatic clarity that would become hallmarks of Rembrandt's greatest works. Painted in 1626 during Rembrandt's formative years in Leiden, Balaam and the Ass is among the earliest examples of the artist's foray into complex biblical subject matter. Now housed in the Musée Cognac J in Paris, the painting demonstrates a youthful Rembrandt's fascination with dramatic narrative, moral ambiguity, and divine human interaction. Although still at the beginning of his career, the artist reveals an early aptitude for psychological realism and narrative tension hallmarks that would come to define his later masterpieces. The painting is based on a passage from the Book of Numbers, chapter 22, in which the pagan prophet Balaam is summoned by the Moabite king Balak to curse the Israelites. As Balaam journeys on his donkey, an angel of the Lord appears before them with a drawn sword. The donkey, able to see the angel while Balaam cannot, turns aside 3 times to avoid the threat. Frustrated, Balaam strikes the animal, prompting God to open the donkey's mouth and allow it to speak. The donkey rebukes its master, exposing his blindness to the divine and setting the stage for the angel's revelation. In his interpretation of this narrative, Rembrandt captures the very moment when the miraculous interrupts the mundane. Balaam, richly robed and raised upon his saddle, is depicted mid-blow, his posture tense with anger and confusion. The donkey turns its head back toward Balaam, its mouth open as it speaks, an expression rendered with a surprising blend of dignity and innocence. The angel, often shown in the background or elevated in space, serves as both a divine presence and a silent judge, visible only to the creature of least importance. Though early in his development, Rembrandt's talent for visual storytelling is already evident. The scene is theatrically composed, with the 3 principal figures arranged in a triangular formation that guides the viewer's eye from Balaam's aggression to the donkey's plea, and ultimately to the angel's quiet authority. The influence of Caravaggio is perceptible in the use of chiaroscuro, particularly in how light dramatizes the angel's appearance. Yet unlike Caravaggio's heightened realism, Rembrandt injects a layer of moral satire into the tableau. Balaam's ornate attire and elevated position contrast sharply with his spiritual ignorance, while the donkey, humble and lowly, becomes the unlikely bearer of truth. Symbolically, the painting explores the theme of spiritual blindness and the inversion of worldly hierarchies. Balaam, though a prophet, is blind to God's presence, whereas his donkey sees clearly. This reversal of expectations carries a moral lesson. Divine wisdom is not reserved for the powerful or learned, but can be spoken through the most unexpected vessels. In this sense, the painting critiques arrogance and false authority, elevating humility and attentiveness as true virtues. Technically, the painting reflects Rembrandt's experimentation with costume, gesture, and setting. The figures are dressed in theatrical, non-biblical attire, a common practice among Dutch painters of the time, which adds to the dramatic staging of the scene. Spatial depth is still developing, and the anatomy is not yet as fluid as in his later works. However, the emotional tension between characters and the layering of visual symbolism mark a significant step in his artistic maturation. Balaam and the Ass is a remarkable work that foreshadows Rembrandt's lifelong engagement with biblical subjects, moral introspection, and human vulnerability. Through this painting, the young artist not only displays technical promise, but also an emerging philosophical vision, one that challenges viewers to reconsider the nature of authority, revelation, and divine justice. The result is a composition that is as instructive as it is imaginative, offering a glimpse into the future genius of one of history's greatest painters. Painted in 1626, the Baptism of the Eunuch is one of the earliest religious compositions by Dutch master Rembrandt van Rijn. Created during his early years in Leiden, this work reflects both the influence of his contemporaries and his own emerging artistic voice. Now housed in the Museum Catharijne Convent in Utrecht, where it has resided since 1976, the painting marks a pivotal moment in Rembrandt's development as a storyteller of sacred history, capturing an episode rich in theological significance and human emotion. The painting illustrates an episode from Acts of the Apostles 8:26-40, in which the Apostle Philip baptizes an Ethiopian eunuch, a high official in the court of the Queen of Ethiopia. According to the biblical text, the eunuch had traveled to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home when he encountered Philip, who explained to him a passage from the prophet Isaiah. Moved by the message of Christ, the eunuch requested to be baptized at the first sight of water, and Philip complied. Rembrandt's rendering of this moment is deeply theatrical and emotionally charged. At the center, Philip leans forward with solemn grace, his hands guiding the ritual gesture of baptism. The eunuch, kneeling and bare-chested, bows his head in humility and faith. The viewer is witness to a sacred transformation, a moment of spiritual rebirth that transcends social status, race, and physical difference. This thematic emphasis on universal salvation is profound for a young artist in the Protestant Netherlands, where the humanist reading of Scripture often highlighted the accessibility of grace to all people. A striking feature of the composition is the diversity of onlookers and attendants, including African figures that Rembrandt portrays with notable dignity and individuality rare for European painters of the time. This attention suggests an early awareness of global Christianity and the complexity of identity, even in Rembrandt's youth. The courtly attire of the eunuch's retinue, along with the ornate textiles and the inclusion of a carriage, further enrich the scene with social context and material realism. From a stylistic perspective, the Baptism of the Eunuch shows the influence of Rembrandt's teacher, Peter Lastman, especially in the arrangement of figures, the attention to historical costume, and the use of dramatic lighting to enhance narrative clarity. Yet even here, Rembrandt begins to assert his own sensibility. The facial expressions are more introspective, the physical gestures more restrained, and the atmosphere more psychologically complex. The baptism is not just a public act, but an inner transformation, quietly monumental. The composition also experiments with spatial layering, guiding the viewer from the foreground's intimate right to the middle and background, where the entourage and landscape open up the scene. Although not yet fully mastered, the attempt at depth and movement reflects Rembrandt's growing confidence in handling complex arrangements and multifigural storytelling. In theological terms, the work touches on essential Protestant themes: personal conversion, the direct relationship between the believer and God, and the spread of the gospel beyond Jewish and Roman boundaries. By choosing this particular episode, Rembrandt emphasizes the message that no one is excluded from divine grace, a revolutionary idea that resonated with the religious currents of his time. The Baptism of the Eunuch stands as a compelling early testament to Rembrandt's ambition and spiritual insight. More than a historical illustration, it is a meditation on faith, inclusion, and transformation. The painting foreshadows many of the qualities that would define Rembrandt's mature work: empathy, narrative depth, and an abiding concern with the soul's encounter with the divine. As such, it deserves recognition not merely as a youthful experiment, but as a meaningful and theologically resonant achievement in its own right. Bust of a man wearing a gorget and plume beret is an oil-on-panel painting dating to 1626-1627. It measures 39.8 by 29.4 centimeters and is held in a private collection. It is believed to be the earliest extant single-figure painting by Rembrandt. The work was painted when Rembrandt was in his early 20s working in Leiden. X-ray analysis shows that it was painted over an earlier work depicting the head of an old man. The identity of the subject is not known, but it is believed to be a character study or trony of a historical character, wearing costume, gorget and cap with feather plume, fashionable in the 15th century, possibly inspired by a woodcut print of a lansquenet. The subject is depicted in a pose typical of Rembrandt's work, with the subject looking over the left shoulder. It uses an exaggerated fall of light, creating bright highlights and deep shadows, perhaps inspired by Caravaggio. Painted in the year 1626, Tobit and Anna with the Kid, also known as Tobit accusing Anna of stealing the kid, or Tobit praying for death, is one of Rembrandt van Rijn's earliest signed works. Created during his formative years in Leiden, this oil painting powerfully reveals the artist's early mastery of human emotion and domestic realism. The canvas draws its subject from the apocryphal Book of Tobit and reflects Rembrandt's lifelong interest in biblical narratives, particularly those that illuminate intimate and moral human struggles. Housed in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, this 1626 canvas concerns the apocryphal Book of Tobit, in which Tobit, the rich, God-fearing Jew, is depicted with his wife Anna. According to the story, Tobit was so strict in his observance of the Mosaic law, he had lost all his money and been blinded by an accident. To keep them both from starving, Anna had taken in work sewing and washing. However, when Tobit heard on one occasion the bleating of a kid, which Anna had been given to supplement her earnings, he falsely accused her of its theft. In the canvas, Rembrandt depicts the moment when she upbraids him for his self-righteousness and their sorry plight. Holding the detected kid, Anna towers dominantly above Tobit, who submissively grips his hands in apology. Compositionally, the figures are placed in a humble interior that Rembrandt renders with painstaking detail and authenticity. The entire scene is bathed in even naturalistic light, with a warm and bright palette that avoids the dramatic tenebrism often found in Caravaggisti art. Rembrandt's brushwork here is remarkably smooth, with strokes so subtle they are nearly invisible, resulting in a surface of refined clarity. The depiction of age seen in Tobit's slumped posture and Anna's expressive face exemplifies one of Rembrandt's most enduring preoccupations: the study of elderly figures. Wrinkles, sagging skin, and awkward bodily movements are presented with honesty and empathy, not idealized or masked. Furthermore, the room is adorned with scattered household items, from textiles and containers to utensils and the goat itself. These still life elements are not heavily symbolic, as in later Dutch paintings, but instead serve to heighten the realism of the scene. By grounding this biblical moment in a modest, believable domestic setting, Rembrandt invites viewers not only to witness a religious story, but to feel its human weight. Tobit and Anna with the Kid is a compelling example of Rembrandt's early genius, a work that foreshadows his later, more mature paintings in its attention to emotional nuance, moral complexity, and realism. Even at the age of 20, Rembrandt was already positioning himself as a master of the human soul, capable of transforming a modest Old Testament episode into a universal drama of misunderstanding, forgiveness, and endurance. The Parable of the Rich Fool, 1627, is a remarkable oil-on-panel work by Rembrandt van Rijn, exemplifying the artist's early mastery of light, shadow, and moral storytelling. Painted during his Leiden period, this composition draws inspiration from the Gospel of Luke, Luke 12:13-21, in which Christ recounts the parable of a wealthy man who hoards his abundance, failing to recognize the fleeting nature of earthly possessions and the primacy of spiritual riches. Rembrandt situates the scene in a dimly lit interior, illuminated by the glow of a single candle or oil lamp, a visual hallmark of his early chiaroscuro style influenced by Caravaggisti painters. The central figure, often interpreted as the rich fool himself, is depicted hunched over a ledger, surrounded by coins, documents, and worldly goods. His concentrated gaze and absorbed posture convey a sense of greed and self-absorption, visually reinforcing the biblical moral: wealth without wisdom is vanity. The dense arrangement of objects, scales, scrolls, and ornate fabrics not only showcases Rembrandt's attention to still life detail, but also serves as a symbolic inventory of material attachment. The light falls sharply on the man's face and hands, emphasizing his grasp on wealth, while the surrounding darkness suggests spiritual blindness. Art historians often praise this painting for its psychological depth. Rather than simply illustrating a biblical moment, Rembrandt offers a moral meditation, encouraging viewers to examine their own relationship with material possessions. The parable of the rich fool thus stands as an early testament to his ability to merge narrative clarity with emotional complexity, anticipating the profound human insight that would define his later masterpieces. The artist in his studio, painted around the year 1629, stands as one of Rembrandt van Rijn's most introspective and conceptually sophisticated early works. Executed in oil on a small wooden panel, the painting now resides in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, where it continues to invite viewers into a world of quiet tension and artistic contemplation. The composition presents a modest, dimly lit room. Against the backdrop of bare plaster walls, simple furniture, and a few scattered objects, an artist stands before a towering canvas placed on an easel. He holds brushes in one hand, yet his stance is still and contemplative. The figure's small scale, when compared to the monumental size of the canvas, creates a striking contrast, one that subtly emphasizes the enormity of the creative task before him. Light falls from the upper left, illuminating the artist's face and tools, and guiding the viewer's gaze toward the easel. However, the canvas itself is turned away, its surface hidden from us, leaving the subject of his work an enigma. This deliberate concealment of the painted image has given rise to a range of interpretations. Some scholars regard the work as a form of self-portrait, though the figure's identity remains uncertain. More compelling, however, is the notion that the painting is not about the act of painting itself, but about the moment preceding it. A mental pause filled with anticipation, doubt, and reflection. In this sense, the work aligns with early 17th century art theory, which held that a great painting must first exist fully formed in the artist's mind before being transferred to canvas. Art historian Christopher Atkins has described the artist in his studio as a picture of thought, a term that captures its essence as a visual meditation on creativity. Rather than dramatizing the physical process of painting, Rembrandt distills the scene to its psychological core, the solitary artist confronting the daunting emptiness of a blank canvas. This is a moment charged not with visible action, but with the invisible labor of imagination. The sparse still life elements in the room, a grinding stone, a table with bottles, pallets hanging on the wall, avoid overt symbolic meaning. Instead, they contribute to the authenticity of the space, grounding the scene in the reality of a working studio. The absence of decorative flourish or narrative excess allows the viewer's attention to settle entirely on the relationship between the artist and his canvas. The artist in his studio transcends its historical context to embody a universal truth. All creation begins in solitude, in the silent dialogue between vision and execution. In elevating this moment of hesitation into a subject worthy of painting, Rembrandt not only reveals his deep understanding of the artist's inner life, but also anticipates themes of psychological depth and human vulnerability that would define his later masterpieces. In 1629, Rembrandt met Constantijn Huygens, a statesman for the court of The Hague, who could procure commissions for the artists. Huygens was a remarkable Dutchman, well informed about art, who spent most of his life in service to the princes of Orange. He operated an art academy where copies of paintings were made and commissions were fulfilled. Huygens urged the two young artists to visit Italy, especially Rome, to learn from the masterpieces, but they were too dedicated to their work in their own beloved country. Simon Schama, in his remarkable historical biography Rembrandt's Eyes, 1999, related that Huygens stated, "I feel it incumbent upon myself to state that I have never observed such dedication and persistence in other men, whatever their pursuits or ages. Truly these youths are redeeming the time. That is their sole consolation. Most amazingly, they regard even the most innocent diversions of youth as a waste of time, as if they were already burdened with age and long-past follies." Huygens had influenced Rembrandt to be more ambitious, so by 1632, Rembrandt moved back to the wealthy, teeming metropolis of Amsterdam. There, he found great satisfaction as a professional portrait painter for the successful men of commerce, the intellectuals, and the religious leaders, who were all appreciating their positions and good fortunes and wanting to exhibit their excellent taste, especially through painted likenesses of themselves. Rembrandt was building his reputation by portraying the Dutch bourgeois burghers as men of action, in three-quarter or full-length poses. Painted between the years 1629 and 1630, Samson and Delilah marks one of Rembrandt van Rijn's most compelling early explorations of biblical drama. Currently housed in the Gemäldegallery Berlin, the work captures the pivotal moment from the Old Testament narrative in the Book of Judges, wherein Samson, endowed with superhuman strength by God, is betrayed by Delilah, the woman he loves. Rembrandt's composition is charged with tension and theatricality. In a dimly lit interior, the viewer witnesses the instant after Samson has fallen into an induced sleep on Delilah's lap. A servant, or possibly a Philistine soldier, reaches forward to cut the locks of Samson's hair, the source of his divine strength, while Delilah turns her gaze away, her expression an ambiguous mix of resolve and unease. The chiaroscuro is pronounced. Strong, concentrated light bathes the central figures, isolating them from the shadowy surroundings and lending the scene both immediacy and intimacy. The artist's treatment of the figures reveals his early mastery of human psychology. Delilah's face is rendered with soft modeling, avoiding the overt villainy found in some earlier depictions of the subject. Instead, she appears contemplative, perhaps even sorrowful, complicating the viewer's judgment of her actions. Samson, by contrast, is portrayed with heavy limbs and a slackened posture. His vulnerability emphasized through the loosened grasp of his hand and the open exposure of his head to the shears. Art historians have noted that Rembrandt's Samson and Delilah diverges from the grandiose heroism typical of earlier Baroque renditions, such as those by Rubens. Rather than framing Samson as a muscular giant locked in a climactic struggle, Rembrandt chooses the moment of quiet betrayal, the prelude to catastrophe. This focus aligns with his broader artistic interest in the psychological and moral dimensions of biblical stories, privileging the human over the purely heroic. Technically, the painting demonstrates the artist's evolving use of light as both a compositional and narrative tool. The illumination does not merely reveal form, it guides moral attention. Samson's illuminated face and Delilah's pale garments draw the eye to their physical and emotional connection, while the surrounding darkness suggests the moral ambiguity and danger enveloping the scene. The rich earthy palette, deep ochres, warm browns, and muted reds, intensifies the sense of intimacy and secrecy. Thematically, Samson and Delilah encapsulates the vulnerability inherent in human relationships, particularly when trust is betrayed. In Rembrandt's hands, the biblical episode becomes more than an illustration of divine punishment. It becomes a study in love, deception, and the fragility of human strength when stripped of its foundation. The restrained drama, concentrated lighting, and nuanced characterizations anticipate the psychological depth that would later define his mature works. In choosing to depict the moment before the irreversible act, Rembrandt invites the viewer into the charged space between intention and consequence. It is in this suspended moment, neither fully past nor fully future, that the painting's true power resides, revealing a young artist already in command of both narrative subtlety and emotional resonance. Painted in 1630, Jeremiah lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem stands among the most celebrated achievements of Rembrandt van Rijn's Leiden period. The work draws from the Old Testament account of the prophet Jeremiah, who foretold the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians and lived to witness the city's destruction. Far from depicting the chaos of battle or the grandeur of prophetic vision, Rembrandt focuses on the quiet, intimate aftermath, a moment of profound personal grief. The composition centers on Jeremiah, seated in the foreground, his head bowed and his face buried in his hand. His posture conveys a weight not only of sorrow, but of resignation. Draped in voluminous robes, the prophet is bathed in a concentrated beam of light that falls from the left, illuminating the furrowed lines of his brow and the coarse texture of his beard. Behind him, through a shadowy archway, the city of Jerusalem burns, its golden glow casting a faint reflection on the stone wall. The juxtaposition of the still figure with the distant conflagration creates a striking visual tension. The outer world is aflame, yet the inner world is consumed by silent despair. Symbolism pervades the work. At Jeremiah's side rests a large vessel, possibly a representation of the temple treasure, hinting at both the loss of sacred objects and the futility of material wealth in the face of divine judgment. This small but potent detail aligns with Rembrandt's narrative economy, where objects are never incidental, but integral to the moral message. In terms of emotional register, Jeremiah lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem departs from the grand gestures and heroic suffering often seen in Baroque history painting. Instead, it invites contemplation. The viewer is not confronted with spectacle but drawn into the inner life of the figure, sharing in his solitude and meditative grief. This approach exemplifies Rembrandt's unique capacity to transform biblical history into a human drama of timeless relevance. Art historians have often remarked that the painting foreshadows the artist's later preoccupation with the psychology of his subjects. The expressive realism in Jeremiah's features, the sag of his shoulders, the heaviness of his hand, conveys lived experience rather than idealized pathos. The prophet is not an untouchable icon. He is an aging man who has seen his warnings ignored and his worst fears fulfilled. Ultimately, the work encapsulates a central paradox in Rembrandt's art: the beauty of light emerging from darkness, not in a triumphal sense, but as a quiet testament to endurance and faith. In capturing the stillness after destruction, Rembrandt turns a biblical lament into a universal meditation on loss, moral duty, and the resilience of the human spirit. Painted around 1630, Anna and the Blind Tobit, also known as Blind Tobit and His Wife, occupies a notable place in the early oeuvre of Rembrandt van Rijn and possibly his pupil Gerrit Dou. Currently housed in the National Gallery, London, the painting draws on the apocryphal Book of Tobit, a text that was particularly popular in 17th century Protestant and Catholic households for its themes of faith, perseverance, and divine providence. The narrative centers on Tobit, an elderly pious Israelite living in exile who has been struck blind. In the painting, Tobit sits hunched, his eyes closed, leaning forward with a sense of quiet resignation. Beside him stands Anna, his devoted wife, engaged in domestic labor, often interpreted as spinning or preparing wool, her face illuminated by a warm shaft of light. Rembrandt eschews grand narrative in favor of a moment of ordinary life imbued with quiet dignity. A hallmark of Rembrandt's Leiden period is the dramatic use of chiaroscuro, here employed to striking effect. The figures emerge from a deep, tenebrous background, the play of light not only revealing textures, the coarse fibers of the wool, the weathered skin of the old man, the rough grain of the wooden table, but also functioning as a theological metaphor. The illumination that touches Anna's face and hands can be read as a symbol of steadfast faith and humble labor, virtues that sustain the household in the absence of worldly fortune. The domestic interior is rendered with meticulous attention to detail, a quality often associated with Gerrit Dou's influence. If Dou did indeed contribute to the work, His hand may be seen in the refined still life elements, the carefully depicted tools, the subtle glint of metal, and the delicate transitions of light on everyday objects. These details root the biblical scene in the lived reality of a 17th century Dutch home, bridging sacred history and contemporary life. Symbolism operates quietly but persistently. Tobit's closed eyes and bowed head evoke the inward gaze of prayer and meditation, while Anna's labor suggests the sustaining power of practical devotion. The composition's modest scale and intimate atmosphere reflect a theological and cultural preference for moral exemplar drawn from ordinary existence, aligning with the Calvinist ethos of moral discipline and humility. What distinguishes Anna and the Blind Tobit from many contemporaneous religious works is its refusal to dramatize suffering. Instead, the painting dwells on endurance, the slow work of faith expressed in the repetitive gestures of daily life. This psychological subtlety is an early indicator of Rembrandt's mature approach, where emotional truth outweighs theatrical display. The painting is less a literal illustration of the Book of Tobit than a meditation on the virtues of constancy and mutual care. By framing divine trial within the textures of the everyday, Rembrandt, and possibly Gerrit Dou, invite the viewer to see the sacred in the ordinary and to recognize that even in the shadow of blindness, there is a light that endures. Painted between 1630 and 1632, the Raising of Lazarus marks one of Rembrandt van Rijn's earliest and most ambitious explorations of biblical drama. Executed in oil on panel, the work is housed today in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Its subject derives from the Gospel of John, chapter 11, the moment when Christ calls Lazarus forth from the tomb, affirming his divine authority over life and death. Rembrandt approaches the scene with a striking theatrical sensibility. The composition is steeped in chiaroscuro, with darkness enveloping the majority of the space, allowing the central beam of light to fall upon Lazarus's partially risen body, Christ's outstretched arm, and the stunned faces of the onlookers. This interplay of light and shadow not only orchestrates the viewer's gaze, but also mirrors the theological transition from spiritual death to renewed life. The figures are arranged to emphasize psychological response over decorative balance. Christ, positioned to the left of center, is cloaked in a radiance that subtly distinguishes him from the surrounding gloom. His gesture, commanding yet tender, bridges the divine and the human. Lazarus, still shrouded in burial cloths, turns his head toward the source of light, his movement arrested between death's inertia and the pull of new vitality. Around them, the witnesses exhibit a range of emotional states: awe, disbelief, and reverent fear. Technically, the painting demonstrates Rembrandt's rapid mastery of dramatic narrative. The brushwork is vigorous in the shadowed areas, lending them a sense of depth and uncertainty, while more precise modeling is reserved for the illuminated forms. The limited palette, dominated by earthy browns, ochres, and muted golds, intensifies the scene's solemnity, avoiding the decorative richness common in earlier northern religious art. Thematically, the raising of Lazarus serves as both a literal biblical illustration and a visual meditation on the mystery of resurrection. Light becomes the central theological metaphor, with Christ as its source. The darkness surrounding the tomb suggests not only physical death but also spiritual ignorance, pierced by the radiance of divine truth. In this respect, Rembrandt's interpretation departs from the more symmetrical and idealized versions by Italian predecessors, favoring instead a raw immediacy rooted in lived human experience. As an early work, the painting foreshadows key traits of Rembrandt's mature style. His emphasis on the psychological over the ornamental, his deep engagement with biblical text, and his use of light as both narrative and symbolic agent. The raising of Lazarus thus stands as a formative example of how the young artist could fuse theological depth with pictorial innovation, setting the stage for his later masterpieces. Painted in 1630, Rembrandt's Andromeda chained to the rocks stands as his earliest full-length mythological female nude, and a daring experiment within the genre of history painting. The work, executed in oil on panel and now preserved in the Mauritshuis, The Hague, draws its subject from Ovid's Metamorphoses. The story of Andromeda, the Ethiopian princess condemned to be sacrificed to a sea monster until her eventual rescue by Perseus. Unlike many of his contemporaries who approached the mythological nude as an opportunity for idealization, Rembrandt chose to depict Andromeda with a raw, almost unsettling realism. Her body is imperfect, rendered with soft flesh and natural proportions rather than classical ideals. The tension in her form, her head turned in fear, her arms bound, her body twisting slightly against the rock, conveys vulnerability and isolation. This divergence from the polished Venus-like archetypes of Italian and Flemish painting underscores Rembrandt's determination to humanize myth rather than transform it into a stage for decorative beauty. The painting's drama lies less in narrative action and more in psychological immediacy. Perseus and the monster are absent. The viewer encounters Andromeda alone in her moment of terror, awaiting an uncertain fate. By eliminating the larger heroic context, Rembrandt magnifies the theme of human suffering and helplessness. The composition directs the eye toward her face, flushed with fear, contrasting with the pale light that falls across her body, caught between innocence and exposure. Technically, the panel demonstrates Rembrandt's early mastery of chiaroscuro. The dark background isolates Andromeda, intensifying her fragility against the looming void. The brushwork in the rock and shadows is vigorous and rough, while her skin is delicately modeled, producing a stark textural contrast that heightens the drama. The restricted color palette, earth tones, subdued highlights, and soft flesh tones, avoids the opulence common in mythological painting, focusing instead on emotional truth. Many artists such as Titian have depicted this story by showing Andromeda, her rescuer Perseus, and the sea monster all in the same composition. Her beauty, as described in her source material, can be seen in some of these other works, along with Perseus's role as her rescuer. In this work, Rembrandt shies away from classical conventions by showing her not as a glamorous beauty, but as a frightened, naturalistic-looking girl. No other figure is included, but her alarmed look out of the picture space to the right creates narrative tension. The painting is an example of Rembrandt's rejection of idealized beauty. Since he did not believe true beauty existed naturally, he painted women as he saw them, naturally imperfect and flawed. Andromeda chained to the rocks represents more than a mythological subject. It reveals Rembrandt's redefinition of the nude as a bearer of human truth, rather than an object of aesthetic perfection. In placing Andromeda's vulnerability at the center, the artist transforms Ovid's tale into a meditation on fear, mortality, and the fragile dignity of the human form. This approach, radical for its time, anticipates the psychological depth that would characterize Rembrandt's later masterpieces, marking the painting as a pivotal moment in the trajectory of his early career. Painted in 1632, Rembrandt's The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicolaes Tulp represents a watershed moment in the artist's career and an enduring icon of Dutch Golden Age painting. Commissioned by the Amsterdam Surgeons Guild for display in their meeting hall, the work embodies the intersection of medicine, civic identity, and the emerging humanist spirit of the 17th century. Today, housed in the Mauritshuis in The Hague, it is widely regarded as one of Rembrandt's early masterpieces. The painting depicts Dr. Nicolaes Tulp, the city's official praelector anatomiae, demonstrating the musculature of a cadaver's left arm to a group of physicians. What could have been a static record of an academic exercise becomes, under Rembrandt's hand, a dynamic composition that dramatizes the pursuit of knowledge. Dr. Tulp is not merely dissecting, he is actively teaching, his gestures and gaze imbuing the moment with intellectual authority. The assembled guild members, portrayed with individualized faces, lean in with varying degrees of curiosity, reflection, and concentration, transforming the scene into a collective meditation on science and mortality. The spectators are various doctors that had paid commissions to the artist to be included in the painting. In the top left-hand corner of the canvas, it is signed Rembrandt. For Eckert 1632, which is most likely the first recorded instance of the artist signing a painting with his forename in its original form, as opposed to using the monogram RHL, Rembrandt Harmensoen of Leiden, demonstrating his growing confidence. During the 17th century, anatomy lessons were a highly regarded social event, taking place in lecture rooms treated like actual theaters, with students, colleagues, and the general public being permitted to attend on payment of an entrance fee. The spectators were appropriately dressed for a solemn social occasion. In recent times, medical specialists have commented on the accuracy of the muscles and tendons painted by the 26-year-old Rembrandt. It is not known where he obtained such detailed knowledge, though it is likely he copied the details from an anatomical textbook. The corpse was the criminal Aris Kint, who was convicted for armed robbery and sentenced to death by hanging and executed earlier on the same day of the scene. Rembrandt chooses to partially shade the face of the corpse, giving a suggestion of umbra mortis, the shadow of death, a technique that he was to use frequently later. Light and shadow, Rembrandt's hallmark, play a critical role in shaping the atmosphere. The cadaver, centrally illuminated, becomes the silent protagonist of the scene. A body simultaneously reduced to scientific specimen and elevated as a stark reminder of human fragility. The physicians, half immersed in shadow, appear almost as participants in a theatrical performance, their expressions captured with psychological acuity. The dramatic chiaroscuro heightens the sense of solemnity, as if the pursuit of anatomical truth is inseparable from a confrontation with death. Compositionally, Rembrandt breaks from tradition. Earlier group portraits often arranged figures in rigid symmetry, but here, the figures form an asymmetrical cluster, their attention converging on both Dr. Tulp's demonstration and the illuminated cadaver. This triangular dynamic creates a visual dialogue between science, authority, and mortality. The open anatomical atlas at the bottom of the canvas grounds the scene in scholarly tradition, linking empirical practice with bookish knowledge. Beyond its immediate function as a guild commission, the painting carries broader cultural resonances. It captures the intellectual climate of the Dutch Republic, where empirical observation and rational inquiry were gaining prominence. Yet it also reminds viewers of the ultimate limits of such knowledge. The dissected body is that of Aris Kint, a convicted criminal, whose anonymity as subject contrasts sharply with the honored presence of the physicians. In this juxtaposition, Rembrandt underscores the tension between the dignity of science and the anonymity of the body it studies. As an early masterpiece, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicolaes Tulp demonstrates Rembrandt's ability to transcend the boundaries of portraiture. He transformed a civic commission into a meditation on knowledge, power, and mortality, themes that would continue to shape his mature works. The painting is not only a record of medical history, but also a timeless reflection on the human condition, staged with the dramatic intensity that became Rembrandt's enduring legacy. Painted around 1631, Old Man with a Gold Chain exemplifies Rembrandt's early mastery of portraiture during his Leiden period. Though the sitter's identity remains uncertain, the work conveys a profound exploration of dignity, character, and status, transcending the boundaries of mere likeness. Now housed in the Art Institute of Chicago, the painting demonstrates how Rembrandt was already developing the psychological depth and dramatic use of light that would define his later masterpieces. The subject is an elderly man, adorned with a gold chain that immediately suggests prestige and authority. Whether the chain was an emblem of civic honor or a painterly invention remains debated. Yet it serves as the visual anchor of the composition. The man's presence is not communicated through overt gesture or narrative, but through the quiet gravity of his expression and the restrained grandeur of his attire. His fur-trimmed cloak, broad hat, and richly rendered textures evoke an aura of solemnity, situating him as a figure of stature, possibly linked to civic or guild office. What sets this portrait apart is Rembrandt's treatment of light and shadow. The face emerges from a dark, undefined background, illuminated with a softness that accentuates the sitter's aged features. The furrowed brow, the weary yet dignified gaze, the subtle droop of the mouth. The chiaroscuro not only enhances the physical presence of the man, but also imbues the image with a meditative stillness. This interplay of light and darkness suggests both the vitality of worldly honor and the inevitability of decline, situating the sitter within the broader human condition. Stylistically, the work reflects Rembrandt's growing independence from his Leiden contemporaries. While other painters of the time often focused on detailed realism, Rembrandt was already experimenting with painterly freedom. The textures of fabric and fur are rendered with bold, suggestive strokes rather than meticulous precision, allowing the viewer's eye to participate in completing the image. This subtle looseness anticipates the expressive technique of his mature period. The ambiguity surrounding the sitter adds another dimension to the painting's resonance. By withholding biographical specificity, Rembrandt universalizes the portrait, transforming it from a mere record of appearance into a meditation on status, age, and mortality. The gold chain, gleaming against the somber palette, becomes both a marker of social achievement and a reminder of its transience. Old Man with a Gold Chain reveals how, even in his early career, Rembrandt could invest portraiture with layers of psychological and symbolic meaning. The painting is at once a celebration of worldly honor and a reflection on its fragility, a work that situates individual identity within the larger narrative of human experience. In this quiet yet powerful image, one already senses the depth of Rembrandt's vision, an art that speaks not only to the eye, but to the conscience and the spirit. This painting, now housed in Walker Art Gallery, Liverpool, illustrates another of Rembrandt's fascinations to dominate his art: the self-portrait. The artist completed over 75 self-portraits in oil, and it has been estimated that 10% of his entire artistic output was dedicated to the depiction of his own facial features. This offers a unique opportunity of surveying a countenance gradually changing over the course of 40 years. Rembrandt's self-portraits have left posterity a visual autobiography of an artist that is simply without parallel in the history of Western art. It is believed he had started making drawings and etchings of himself in 1628, and this habit would not stop until his death in 1669. Rembrandt often used his self-portraits for practice in order to discover for himself the range of expressions the human face is capable. As models could be expensive and impatient subjects, painting himself was a much more financial and feasible option for a young and aspiring artist to use. From the period of his first studio in Leiden, Rembrandt felt he needed a better understanding of the scope of human emotions, which he could then use to depict in his subject pictures. Also, there was a large demand for head and shoulders portraits at the time, marked by a strong facial expression. These works were known as Trony paintings. Rembrandt therefore decided to combine the self-portrait with the Trony genre to develop his own original style. In time, he realized that more normal and less pronounced and emotional portraits of himself were marketable. The Liverpool self-portrait demonstrates the features of both genres. The hallmarks of a Trony are clearly shown by the conventional head and shoulders depiction of the artist, whilst the somewhat comical, wry look and twisted mouth of the artist reveal the study of expression that the self-portrait affords the artist. Interestingly, not long after its completion, the canvas was purchased by Robert Kerr, the Earl of Ancram, who then gave it to King Charles III. Therefore, it is widely believed to be the first work by to leave the Netherlands and arrive in Britain. Painted in 1631, portrait of Nicolaes Roots is among Rembrandt's earliest known commissioned portraits, marking a decisive step in his rise as a professional portrait painter. The sitter, Nicolaes Roots, was a prosperous merchant involved in the fur trade, a profession that connected the Dutch Republic to the broader global networks of commerce and wealth during the Golden Age. Commissioned at a time when Rembrandt was establishing himself in Amsterdam, this portrait demonstrates both his technical virtuosity and his acute sensitivity to character, qualities that would secure his reputation among the city's elite patrons. At first glance, the painting projects authority and respectability. Roots is depicted seated, turned slightly toward the viewer, dressed in a dark robe trimmed with fur, an attire that resonates with his mercantile profession. His right hand holds a sheet of paper, perhaps a reference to trade or accounts, subtly reinforcing his identity as a man of business. The solemnity of his pose, combined with the understated luxury of his clothing, constructs an image of a man who commanded both economic success and social standing. Rembrandt's handling of light and texture elevates this otherwise conventional portrait into a work of striking immediacy. The sitter's face, lined with age yet alert with intelligence, is illuminated against a muted background. The painter's chiaroscuro emphasizes the depth of expression, making the merchant's presence palpable. Every detail, from the glint of the fur lining to the slight roughness of the skin, is rendered with painterly precision, signaling Rembrandt's growing ability to merge realism with psychological depth. Symbolically, the portrait reflects not only the sitter's individuality but also the broader ethos of the Dutch Golden Age. In a republic where wealth was increasingly derived from commerce rather than aristocratic lineage, portraits such as this became powerful markers of social identity. Roots is presented not as a nobleman but as a man of trade whose success granted him dignity and influence. The document in his hand serves as both a literal and metaphorical emblem, a contract, a record, a testimony to the written and financial systems that underpinned the era's prosperity. The commission of this portrait was pivotal for Rembrandt. In portraying Roots, he secured entry into the lucrative Amsterdam portrait market, a sphere that would bring him influential clients and long-term stability. Yet even at this early stage, Rembrandt distinguished himself from other portraitists by avoiding superficial likeness. Instead, he imbued his sitter with gravitas, rendering not only the external likeness of a wealthy merchant, but also the inner presence of a man whose life was intertwined with the rhythms of trade, ambition, and mortality. Thus, Portrait of Nicolaes Roots is more than a record of an individual. It is a portrait of a social type that embodied the Dutch Republic's rise. The painting captures the merging of personal identity with economic authority, all while foreshadowing Rembrandt's lifelong ability to give his sitters psychological depth and spiritual weight. For both artist and subject, the work stands as a monument to ambition realized, one through commerce, the other through art. Painted in 1632, Portrait of a Man, probably a member of the Van Beresteyn family, and Portrait of a Woman, probably a member of the Van Beresteyn family, now housed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, stand as one of Rembrandt's earliest ventures into pendant portraiture for the Amsterdam elite. Commissioned at a moment when marriage portraits were a crucial visual medium for asserting social status, wealth, and lineage, the pair embodies both the conventions of Dutch portraiture and Rembrandt's innovative approach to character and realism. The male sitter is depicted with a newly fashionable lace collar, replacing the rigid millstone collars of the previous generation. His sober black attire, offset by the brightness of the lace, signals both Protestant restraint and material prosperity. The female pendant complements this carefully curated image. She wears a similarly dark gown enriched with delicate lace and jewelry, including a chain and a modestly adorned headdress. The harmony between the two portraits underscores the cultural expectation that husband and wife should be represented in visual balance, thereby projecting familial unity and continuity. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Rembrandt refuses to idealize. The man's steady, confident gaze is tempered by a certain introspection, while the woman's expression reveals composure tinged with quiet dignity. This psychological naturalism distinguishes Rembrandt from portraitists who prioritized elegance over individuality. In both works, Rembrandt combines meticulous attention to surface textures, lace, fabric, skin with a deeper concern for inner life, suggesting the sitters as complex, sentient beings rather than mere symbols of status. The pendant structure is essential. Each sitter is positioned slightly turned toward the other, a compositional device that visually binds them across the two canvases. This mirroring effect, reinforced by the alignment of light sources and similar neutral backgrounds, establishes a dialogue between husband and wife. Together, the works project not only personal identity but also the unity of a household, a theme particularly significant in the Dutch Republic where family, commerce, and civic identity were tightly intertwined. These portraits testify to Rembrandt's early integration into the Amsterdam art market, where pendant marriage portraits were in high demand. By satisfying the patron's expectations of dignity, fashion, and social representation, while simultaneously introducing his hallmark naturalism and psychological depth, Rembrandt demonstrated his capacity to navigate between tradition and innovation. Furthermore, the works mark a crucial step in his career. From Leiden history painter to Amsterdam portraitist sought after by the mercantile and patrician elite. Viewed together, the portrait of a man and portrait of a woman, probably members of the Van Beresteyn family, transcend their immediate function as commissioned likenesses. They crystallize a social and familial identity within the Dutch Golden Age, while also revealing Rembrandt's emerging genius in portraiture. As pendants, they embody the cultural ideals of marital harmony and continuity, yet through Rembrandt's hand they also achieve a timeless quality, transforming personal likeness into enduring works of psychological and artistic depth. Among the most captivating and debated works attributed to Rembrandt is the painting traditionally known as Philosopher in Meditation, recently retitled Philosopher in Contemplation by the Musée du Louvre in Paris, where it is currently housed. Executed in the early 1630s, the small oil painting occupies an outsized place in art historical discourse. This is not because of monumental scale or narrative clarity, but rather due to its enigmatic subject, its remarkable treatment of light and space, and the haunting stillness it communicates. It is a work that resists definitive categorization, lying at the threshold between genre painting, allegory, and meditation on the very act of contemplation itself. The title Philosopher in Meditation implies an intellectual portrait, an image of a great thinker absorbed in reflection, perhaps in line with the humanist admiration for classical philosophy during the Dutch Golden Age. Yet no textual or visual evidence links the scene to a specific philosopher, nor is there anything in the figure's attributes, his modest chair, his plain interior, or his unadorned appearance, that would directly signal an identity such as Aristotle, Seneca, or any other classical sage. Instead, the canvas shows an elderly man seated beside a window, bathed in golden light, while a second figure tends a fire in the shadows. To impose the label philosopher may be more an invention of later collectors and interpreters than of Rembrandt himself. The Louvre's choice to rename the work Philosopher in Contemplation acknowledges this interpretive uncertainty. Contemplation is a broader, less historically determined term. It suggests not a particular individual or doctrine, but rather a human act, the turning inward of thought, the silent process of reflection, or the search for meaning beyond immediate appearances. This subtle shift in title transforms the painting from a portrait of someone specific to an allegory of a universal human condition. Central to the painting's power is its masterful use of chiaroscuro. Light filters through the window on the left, spreading warmth across the seated figure, his table, and the surrounding floor, before dissipating gradually into the encompassing shadows. The golden illumination is not simply naturalistic. It functions symbolically, suggesting revelation, knowledge, or spiritual clarity. The spiral staircase that ascends into shadow at the right-hand side has often been read allegorically as well. It might symbolize the ascent of the soul toward higher wisdom, the gradual climb of intellectual and spiritual labor, or the mysterious path that remains hidden from human perception. Here, Rembrandt, or an artist closely connected to his circle, demonstrates not only technical virtuosity but also an ability to infuse architectural space with metaphysical resonance. The light does not merely describe objects, it interprets them, turning the domestic into the sublime. Unlike the large-scale history paintings that Rembrandt was also producing during his early career, Philosopher in Contemplation operates within the intimate scale of a domestic interior, yet this smallness is deceptive. The painting creates a psychological vastness that seems to extend beyond its frame. The presence of the second figure near the fireplace reinforces the ordinariness of the setting. Still, the quiet atmosphere, the balance between light and darkness, and the emptiness of much of the space invite the viewer to read the scene as more than mere genre painting. What is striking is the way the painting elicits contemplation from its viewers. The elderly man's absorption in thought mirrors the viewer's own attempt to decipher the meaning of the work. In this sense, the canvas becomes performative. It does not simply depict contemplation, it enacts it. To look upon the painting is to be drawn into an act of silent meditation alongside the figure himself. To appreciate the uniqueness of this canvas, it is useful to compare it to the works of Rembrandt's contemporaries in Leiden, such as Gerrit Dou and Jan Lievens. These artists also painted scholars, readers, and candlelit interiors. But their works emphasized descriptive detail, symbolic objects, or moralizing clarity. By contrast, Rembrandt's approach here is deliberately ambiguous. He suppresses anecdotal detail in favor of atmosphere, allows light to dissolve rather than define forms, and uses emptiness as much as fullness to generate meaning. The result is not an illustration but an evocation, a painting that withholds certainty to make space for introspection. Whether entirely by Rembrandt's hand or the work of someone within his immediate circle remains a matter of scholarly debate. Nevertheless, the canvas embodies themes that would define Rembrandt's mature career: the dignity of the ordinary, the spiritual resonance of light, and the representation of inner life rather than outward grandeur. It anticipates his later portraits and biblical scenes, where narrative is often subdued in favor of psychological depth and existential reflection. Philosopher in Contemplation endures precisely because it refuses to be pinned down. It is not simply a portrait, nor a strict allegory, nor a domestic scene, but something between all of these, a meditation on meditation itself. In its quiet play of light and shadow, in its architectural ascent into darkness, and in its still human presence, the painting embodies both the mystery of knowledge and the humility of human existence. The viewer is left not with answers, but with an invitation to reflect, to contemplate, and to embrace the very uncertainty that is at the heart of philosophical inquiry. Rembrandt's The Abduction of Europa, 1632, occupies a special place in his oeuvre as one of his rare mythological subject paintings, a genre he only occasionally explored throughout his career. Painted in oil on a single oak panel and now housed in the J. Paul Getty Museum, this work reveals Rembrandt's ability to translate ancient classical narratives into powerful visual dramas that transcend their mythological origins. The painting draws its subject from Ovid's Metamorphoses, recounting the story of Europa, the Phoenician princess abducted by Jupiter, who had assumed the form of a bull. Rembrandt captures the dramatic moment of the abduction as Europa, clad in rich garments, is carried away across the water on the bull's back, while her attendants stand at the shore in shock and despair. Instead of treating the scene with the distant grandeur typical of classical depictions, Rembrandt brings the story into a familiar, almost contemporary Dutch setting. The costumes, the landscape, and even the staging bears strong Northern European characteristics, as if Europa's abduction unfolded not in the distant mythic past, but in the artist's own time. This localization of myth was deliberate. By embedding the ancient narrative in a recognizable Dutch environment, Rembrandt not only made the story more immediate and relatable, but also emphasized its allegorical dimensions. The abduction of Europa, beyond its literal telling, could be interpreted as a metaphor for loss, transformation, and destiny, universal themes that resonated deeply in a society marked by political upheavals and shifting fortunes in the early 17th century. The handling of light and color in the composition is particularly striking. Europa, dressed in luminous fabrics that shimmer under Rembrandt's golden light, becomes the emotional and visual center of the painting. The bull, half submerged in water, exudes both calm power and inevitable danger, a symbol of the inescapable fate awaiting the princess. The attendants on the shore, gesturing, leaning, and recoiling in varied postures, heighten the drama, making the viewer complicit in their shock and helplessness. What distinguishes Rembrandt's abduction of Europa from other treatments of the same subject, such as those by Titian or Rubens, is its psychological depth. Rather than indulging in overt sensuality or mythological spectacle, Rembrandt emphasizes Europa's vulnerability and the unsettling tension between beauty and peril. The scene becomes less a celebration of myth and more a poignant exploration of human emotion in the face of irreversible change. In this work, we also see the early hallmarks of Rembrandt's mature style, his mastery of chiaroscuro, his ability to create atmosphere through the modulation of light, and his narrative sensibility that turns myth into lived human experience. The abduction of Europa is not merely a mythological painting. It is a meditation on transition, fear, and destiny, rendered with the sensitivity and dramatic intensity that would come to define Rembrandt's artistic legacy. This 1632 portrait, which is housed in the Dulwich Picture Gallery, London, was completed soon after Rembrandt's arrival in Amsterdam, heralding the beginning of his association with the art dealer Hendrik van Eulenburg, with whom the artist established a busy portrait practice following the great success of the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp. The portrait presents Jacques de Guin, 1596 to 1641, who was the son and grandson of artists of the same name and featured as half of a pair of pendant portraits. The other piece is a portrait of de Guin's friend Maurits Huygens, wearing similar clothing including ruffs and black doublets and depicted facing in the opposite direction. Guin and Huygens were close friends living in The Hague, where the latter was secretary to the Council of State, an administrative body under the States General of the Republic. Degain, like his father and grandfather, was a painter and draftsman, although not very prolific, most likely due to his vast inheritance. The two portraits were almost certainly painted by Rembrandt during a visit to The Hague, and it is believed that the artist was already acquainted with the sitters, as Degain already owned one of Rembrandt's early works. Unusual for the artist's oeuvre, both the portraits are under life-size, though the smooth application of paint with meticulous eye for detail more than compensates for the lack in size. The Degain portrait has been stolen numerous times, as its minute size has aided thieves in its numerous thefts. The painting has been given the nickname Takeaway Rembrandt, as it has been stolen 4 times since 1966, the most recorded of any painting. Between 14th August 1981 and 3rd September 1981, the painting was taken from Dulwich Picture Gallery and retrieved when police arrested 4 men in a taxi who had the painting with them. 2 years later, a burglar smashed a skylight and descended into the art gallery, using a crowbar to remove the painting from the wall. The police arrived within 3 minutes but were too late to apprehend the thief. The painting was missing for 3 years, eventually being found in October 1986 in a luggage rack at the train station of a British Army garrison in Münster, Germany. The other 2 times, the painting was found once underneath a bench in a graveyard in Streatham and once on the back of a bicycle. Each time the painting has been returned anonymously, with more than one person being charged for its disappearance. Rembrandt's portrait of a 62-year-old woman, possibly Eltje Peters de Eulenburg, now preserved in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, exemplifies his early mastery of portraiture during his years in Amsterdam. Painted in oil on panel and rendered in an oval format, the work portrays an elderly woman dressed with restraint, wearing a modest black gown and a small millstone collar. More sober than the large, elaborate versions fashionable just decades earlier. The sitter has long been identified as possibly Eltje Peters de Eulenburg, the wife of Johannes Cornelis Sylvius and the aunt of Rembrandt's future wife, Saskia van Eulenburg. This connection, though not definitively established, is significant, as it situates the portrait within the artist's expanding network of patrons and acquaintances in Amsterdam during the early 1630s. The year 1632 marked a crucial phase in Rembrandt's career. His move from Leiden to the Dutch capital, his first major commissions, and his growing reputation as one of the most promising young painters of the Dutch Republic. The painting is remarkable for its psychological depth and dignity. Rembrandt's sensitive brushwork conveys the signs of age, the fine wrinkles, the sunken cheeks, the weariness of the eyes without diminishing the sitter's authority and humanity. Rather than idealizing her, he confronts the viewer with a truthful yet respectful portrayal, imbuing her with gravity and spiritual presence. The subtle play of light across her face emphasizes both the fragility of old age and the enduring vitality of her character. The oval format, relatively unusual for Rembrandt at this stage, enhances the intimacy of the composition. The restrained clothing and the plain background eliminate distractions, focusing attention on the sitter's face, which emerges as the central locus of identity and expression. Unlike the grand civic or marriage portraits of the period, which often featured elaborate gestures, accessories, or symbols of wealth, this painting insists on simplicity and directness, underscoring Rembrandt's ability to distill essence over ornament. If the identification with Aaltje Uylenburg is correct, the portrait may also reflect broader familial and social ties. The Uylenburg family played a pivotal role in Rembrandt's integration into Amsterdam's artistic and mercantile elite. Commissioning a portrait of an elder matriarch could have functioned both as a commemoration of lineage and as a public affirmation of virtue and respectability. What ultimately distinguishes the work, however, is Rembrandt's profound humanism. The sitter is neither glorified nor diminished. She is seen as she is with all the gravity of her 62 years, her wisdom, and her quiet strength. The painting thus exemplifies Rembrandt's lifelong preoccupation with capturing the essence of human existence, age, mortality, dignity, and presence. Through Portrait of a 62-year-old woman, Rembrandt not only demonstrates his technical brilliance, but also his capacity to reveal the spiritual and emotional depth of his sitters, even when stripped of luxury and external grandeur. In this way, the work stands as a testament to his role as one of the foremost portraitists of the Dutch Golden Age. The Shipbuilder and His Wife, 1633, now in the Royal Collection, represents one of the most extraordinary double portraits of the Dutch Golden Age. At first glance, it appears to be a conventional marriage portrait, yet Rembrandt transforms the genre by capturing an unprecedented moment of intimacy, spontaneity, and shared life. The painting depicts Jan Rijksen, a prominent master shipbuilder and shareholder of the Dutch East India Company, alongside his wife Griet Jans Rijksen. The identification of the sitters was only firmly established in 1970, but it immediately illuminated the work's social and historical resonance. Jan Rijksen was a man of stature and responsibility, having attained the influential position of master shipbuilder in 1620. A role essential to the expansion of Dutch maritime dominance. The portrait, therefore, does not merely record two individuals, it encapsulates the wealth, industriousness, and maritime ambitions of the Dutch Republic itself. Unlike traditional paired portraits in which husband and wife are presented in static facing poses, Rembrandt depicts an animated domestic interaction. Jan Rijksen, seated at his desk, is interrupted by his wife, who enters with a letter. He looks up from his papers with a sense of urgency, while she leans forward, hand extended, as if delivering news of immediate importance. The effect is theatrical, yet natural, suggesting an unfolding moment caught mid-action. This dynamic approach distinguishes Rembrandt's vision from his contemporaries, who often prioritized formality and decorum over lived experience. The composition underscores themes of partnership and complementarity. Jan Rijksen, dressed in sober black, embodies professional authority, his hand resting on documents that signify his role in the Dutch East India Company. Griet Jans, clad in a dark gown with a modest collar, radiates domestic responsibility and loyalty. Yet rather than subordinating her presence, Rembrandt accords her equal visual weight. Her poised gesture and forward movement suggest active participation in her husband's affairs, an acknowledgement of the collaborative nature of marriage and household management in Dutch burgher culture. Light plays a crucial role in animating the scene. It falls across the couple's faces and hands, guiding the viewer's gaze toward their exchange. The tonal contrasts, characteristic of Rembrandt's style in the early 1630s, create both drama and intimacy. The restricted palette of blacks, whites, and earth tones reinforces sobriety while heightening the sense of immediacy. Beyond its technical brilliance, the painting is radical in its conception of marriage. It does not idealize the sitters as remote symbols of wealth or lineage, but presents them as partners engaged in shared concerns, domestic, commercial, and perhaps emotional. This merging of private life with public identity was deeply resonant in a society where the family unit was central to economic and social stability. Since entering the royal collection in 1811, the shipbuilder and his wife has been admired as one of Rembrandt's most innovative achievements. It marks a turning point in the genre of portraiture. No longer a static likeness, but a living drama of human interaction. In celebrating both individuality and partnership, Rembrandt redefined the possibilities of portraiture in 17th century Dutch art. Painted in 1633, Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee stands as one of the earliest and most monumental works of Rembrandt van Rijn's career, and significantly, the only seascape he is known to have painted. This oil-on-canvas masterpiece, once displayed in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston until its infamous theft in 1990, dramatizes one of the most powerful miracles recorded in the Gospels. Christ's calming of the storm, Mark 4:35-41, with parallels in Luke 8:22-25 and Matthew 14:22-33. The scene encapsulates Rembrandt's ability to merge biblical narrative with visceral human experience, transforming sacred text into an electrifying visual drama. The painting captures the precise moment of chaos when Jesus and his disciples are caught in a violent squall on the Sea of Galilee. The composition, nearly cinematic in its intensity, reveals a boat tilted precariously as towering waves crash against it. The mast bends under pressure, and figures cling desperately to ropes and rigging. Each disciple embodies a different human response to crisis: terror, prayer, frantic action, and resignation. Some strain with physical exertion, others collapse in despair, while one figure thought to be a self-portrait of Rembrandt gazes directly out at the viewer, drawing us into the storm's peril. At the heart of the painting lies the contrast between divine serenity and human panic. Amid the chaos, Christ remains calm, his presence a stabilizing force within the turbulence. His raised hand gestures toward divine authority over nature, foreshadowing his command: "Peace, be still." Mark 4:39. The juxtaposition of the disciples' raw, human vulnerability with Christ's composed figure articulates the central theological message: faith triumphs over fear, when anchored in divine power. Rembrandt heightens this spiritual and emotional drama through masterful manipulation of light and shadow. A beam of illumination slices across the waves, spotlighting the figures at the center of the action, while the storm clouds roil in darkness above. The Chiaroscuro not only intensifies the drama but also symbolizes the passage from fear and doubt toward divine deliverance. The turbulence of brushwork in the sea contrasts with the solidity of Christ, further emphasizing the theme of divine constancy amidst human instability. As a history painting, the work exemplifies Rembrandt's ambition to elevate biblical narrative into the highest category of art, demanding intellectual and spiritual engagement. Yet unlike many artists of his era who idealized religious scenes, Rembrandt infused the story with unvarnished realism. The disciples are ordinary men, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion, their gestures chaotic and uncoordinated. This humanization makes the miracle all the more compelling, as viewers are invited to see themselves reflected in the disciples' doubt and terror, and to find reassurance in Christ's presence. The painting's subsequent history deepens its aura of mystery and poignancy. Purchased in 1898 by Bernard Berenson for Isabella Stewart Gardner, it became a jewel of her Boston collection, admired for its rarity and grandeur. Its theft in 1990, one of the most notorious art heists in modern history, has left its fate uncertain. The absence of the painting has paradoxically amplified its legend, making it a symbol not only of Rembrandt's genius but also of the fragility of cultural heritage. In Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee, Rembrandt demonstrates the dual powers of painting: to narrate a sacred event and to embody universal human truths. By presenting the storm not merely as a physical tempest but as a metaphor for the struggles of faith, Rembrandt offers a meditation on doubt, trust, and divine providence. The work remains one of the most powerful testaments to his ability to fuse realism with transcendence, situating human fragility against the backdrop of divine authority. Rembrandt's Raising of the Cross and the Descent from the Cross, both painted in 1633 for Frederick Henry, Prince of Orange, form a diptych that stands as one of the most powerful religious statements of the Dutch Golden Age. Together, they present a complete theological meditation on suffering, sacrifice, and redemption, while simultaneously reflecting the cultural and political aspirations of the Dutch Republic. Housed today in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich, these two works are among the rare Rembrandt paintings with continuous provenance since their completion, testifying not only to their artistic significance, but also to their enduring spiritual resonance. Raising of the Cross depicts the climactic moment when Christ's crucifixion is set in motion. The diagonal thrust of the cross dominates the composition, creating an overwhelming sense of physical strain. Soldiers and executioners exert their bodies against the massive timber, their contorted forms embodying the brutality of human violence. In sharp contrast, the figure of Christ, illuminated by a shaft of divine light, remains passive, resigned, and transcendent. Rembrandt's Chiaroscuro reinforces this polarity. The radiant Christ emerges from a shroud of darkness, visually asserting the theological claim that divine salvation shines through human sin. Scholars have long debated the presence of a Rembrandt self-portrait among those raising the cross. suggesting the artist's own confession of complicity in humanity's collective guilt. If Raising of the Cross dramatizes the violence of sin, the Descent from the Cross meditates on the grief of loss. Here, the body of Christ is carefully lowered into the arms of his followers, a scene suffused with tenderness and sorrow. The figures move slowly and deliberately, their gestures choreographed with solemn reverence. Unlike the muscular exertion of the earlier painting, the emphasis here is on gentleness. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea handle Christ's body with a quiet intimacy that mirrors the emotional desolation of Mary and the disciples. The atmosphere is less theatrical but equally profound, inviting contemplation of Christ's humanity, mortality, and the depth of his followers' devotion. Viewed together, the two paintings form a theological arc. Raising of the Cross captures the moment of ultimate humiliation and suffering, underscoring humanity's role in Christ's death. In contrast, the Descent from the Cross conveys the aftermath of that violence: grief, mourning, and the tender recognition of Christ's sacrifice. The diptych thus unites two fundamental dimensions of Christian meditation: the cruelty of sin and the hope of redemption. By placing the viewer in proximity to both scenes, Rembrandt compels reflection not only on the historical narrative but also on the existential weight of human responsibility and divine grace. Commissioned by Frederick Henry, the paintings also carried a political subtext. In a republic forged through conflict with Catholic Spain, such works asserted a distinctly Protestant visual culture. Rembrandt's monumental crucifixion scenes rival the grandeur of Counter-Reformation altarpieces, yet they were adapted for the Reformed context, emphasizing moral introspection, human frailty, and spiritual transformation over liturgical spectacle. For Frederick Henry, these paintings symbolized both the triumph of Protestant faith and the resilience of the Dutch state, framing religious devotion as a form of national identity. Taken individually, Raising of the Cross and the Descent from the Cross stand as masterpieces of dramatic intensity and emotional pathos. Considered together, they form a profound diptych that encapsulates the paradox at the heart of Christian theology: the brutality of crucifixion as the path to redemption, and the sorrow of death as the prelude to resurrection. Through his manipulation of light, form, and gesture, Rembrandt elevates these biblical scenes into universal meditations on suffering, compassion, and hope. Their continuing resonance, both theological and artistic, lies in this delicate balance between violence and tenderness, darkness and light, despair and salvation. Diana bathing with her nymphs with Actaeon and Callisto, 1634, now housed in the Samsam Princely collection at Wasserburg-Anhalt, is among the artist's most ambitious mythological works. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who often approached classical subject matter with idealized beauty and compositional harmony, Rembrandt infused mythological narratives with psychological intensity, moral ambiguity, and striking realism. This particular painting intertwines two separate episodes from Ovid's Metamorphoses: the story of Actaeon's fatal transgression and Callisto's shameful expulsion from Diana's circle into a single, complex tableau, thereby foregrounding themes of chastity, punishment, and divine retribution. On the left side of the canvas, Rembrandt depicts Actaeon's accidental intrusion upon Diana while she bathes, a moment that seals his fate. In Ovid's narrative, the goddess transforms him into a stag, and he is subsequently torn apart by his own hounds. Although Rembrandt refrains from showing the climactic violence, the foreshadowing of Actaeon's doom resonates throughout the composition. By placing the viewer in proximity to Actaeon's transgressive gaze, Rembrandt emphasizes the moral gravity of voyeurism, underscoring the consequences of violating divine boundaries. On the right, a contrasting drama unfolds with the exposure of Callisto. Diana's nymphs forcibly strip away her garments, revealing her pregnancy by Jupiter, a revelation that provokes both shame and exile. Unlike Actaeon's external transgression, Callisto's narrative revolves around internal betrayal, her inability to maintain the vow of chastity imposed by Diana. The psychological tension of this moment is palpable. Callisto's vulnerability contrasts with the almost cruel insistence of her companions, while Diana herself embodies implacable judgment. The dual placement of these myths within one pictorial field accentuates the goddess's role as an unforgiving guardian of purity, applying punishment indiscriminately to both men and women who fail to uphold her code. Unusually, Rembrandt incorporates figures that diverge from the main mythological narrative. An elderly couple in the background and a middle-aged nymph in the foreground. Their presence has puzzled scholars, as they neither belong to Actaeon's nor Callisto's story. Interpretations range from allegorical readings, suggesting themes of human aging, wisdom, or moral oversight, to compositional devices that anchor the mythological spectacle in a more earthly, human context. These inclusions reflect Rembrandt's characteristic tendency to resist straightforward illustration, instead layering myth with realism and ambiguity. Stylistically, the painting showcases Rembrandt's mastery of chiaroscuro and narrative density. The juxtaposition of light and shadow not only highlights the physicality of the figures, but also dramatizes the moral stakes at play. Diana's radiant form commands attention, while the partially illuminated figures of Actaeon and Callisto suggest their impending downfall. The naturalism of bodily forms, rendered with Rembrandt's characteristic sensitivity to texture and movement, situates the divine within a tangible human reality, bridging the gap between myth and lived experience. In conclusion, Diana bathing with her nymphs with Actaeon and Callisto exemplifies Rembrandt's ability to reimagine classical mythology through a lens of moral seriousness and psychological depth. By combining two episodes from Ovid into a single narrative field, he not only underscores Diana's uncompromising authority, but also explores broader themes of sexuality, transgression, and divine justice. The inclusion of extraneous figures further destabilizes the boundaries between myth and reality, inviting viewers to reflect on the universal relevance of these ancient tales. In this work, Rembrandt transcends the decorative function of mythological painting, transforming it into a meditation on human frailty and the inexorable consequences of desire and disobedience. In 1633, during his early Amsterdam years, Rembrandt produced a remarkable pair of pendant portraits. Portrait of a Man Rising from His Chair, Taft Museum of Art, Cincinnati, and Portrait of a Young Woman with a Fan, Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. These works, though separated today by geography, were conceived as a unified visual statement, depicting husband and wife in complementary poses. Together they reveal not only Rembrandt's acute sensitivity to the conventions of Dutch marital portraiture, but also his ambition to expand those conventions through dramatic gesture and psychological presence. In Portrait of a Man Rising from His Chair, the sitter is captured in the very moment of action. He pushes himself upward with one hand upon the chair while turning outward to engage the viewer. This unusual motif, rare in early 17th century portraiture, imparts a sense of immediacy and vitality, as though the man were prepared to step beyond the pictorial frame. By disrupting the static decorum of conventional portraiture, Rembrandt imbues the sitter with individuality, confidence, and social assertion. The gesture may also symbolize readiness, an embodied metaphor for civic responsibility or professional duty within the rising Amsterdam elite. The pendant portrait, Portrait of a Young Woman with a Fan, provides a contrasting yet complementary counterpart. The woman, richly attired in black dress and lace ruff, holds a delicate fan with poise and refinement. Her figure is more static than her husband's, yet her calm presence and subtle smile balance the man's dynamic movement. The fan, both fashionable accessory and signifier of cultivated elegance, underscores her social standing, while Rembrandt's meticulous rendering of textures, lace, silk, and the shimmer of pearls speaks to his virtuosity in material illusion. When viewed together, the pendants articulate a dialectic between motion and stillness, assertion and composure, masculine energy and feminine grace. Rembrandt thus constructs not only individual likenesses but also a visual narrative of conjugal harmony. Such paired portraits were central to Dutch elite identity in the 17th century, functioning as markers of marriage, prosperity, and lineage. Yet Rembrandt's treatment distinguishes itself from contemporaries like Thomas de Keyser or Frans Hals through heightened psychological intensity and dramatic staging, qualities that would come to define his mature portraiture. Equally important is the interplay of light and shadow. In both portraits, Rembrandt employs a controlled chiaroscuro that models the faces with sculptural precision while enveloping the background in darkness. This effect isolates the figures, concentrating attention on their expressions and gestures. The result is a theater of presence. The man caught mid-gesture, the woman poised in serene dignity, each commanding the viewer's regard in distinct but complementary registers. Portrait of a Man Rising from His Chair and Portrait of a Young Woman with a Fan exemplify Rembrandt's early mastery of pendant portraiture. Beyond mere likeness, they construct a dialogue between two sitters that embodies ideals of marriage, status, and individuality. By infusing traditional formats with theatricality and psychological depth, Rembrandt transforms the genre into a stage where human presence, social aspiration, and artistic innovation converge. In Amsterdam, Rembrandt initially stayed with an art dealer named Hendrik van Uylenburg. It was there that the artist met Hendrik's cousin Saskia van Uylenburg, who was the daughter of a wealthy burgomaster. The two married in 1634. Rembrandt was known as a prosperous and fashionable young artist at this time, but he yearned to be considered a gentleman and an intellectual. His new wife was able to introduce him to notable members of society through her well-connected extended family. In 1632, Rembrandt painted a group portrait called The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulp, which brought him enormous attention. That same year, he became a burgess of Amsterdam and a member of the local Guild of Painters. Throughout the 1630s, Rembrandt produced at least 65 commissioned portraits. He also painted biblical and mythological paintings, landscapes and portraits of anonymous people who were interesting to him, such as Jewish people, officers in uniforms, or foreigners in exotic dress. Like many wealthy men of the time period, Rembrandt collected works of art, but also armor, costumes, oriental turbans, and other curiosities from foreign places. Some of these acquisitions often ended up as props in his work, such as curved sabers, Javanese daggers, and Polish stirrups. When he attended auctions, according to the Italian art historian and biographer Filippo Baldinucci, he acquired clothes that were old-fashioned and disused as long as they struck him as bizarre and picturesque. And he also bid so high at the outset that no one else came forward to bid. And he said he did this in order to emphasize the prestige of his profession. His paintings and etchings show that he had been greatly influenced by the exuberance of Peter Paul Rubens' style, characters, and poses. He wanted the rich life that Rubens enjoyed, full of horses, servants, grooms, cooks, and paint grinders. Rembrandt thoroughly enjoyed being at the height of his powers and reputation. In 1634, the year of his marriage to Saskia van Uylenburg, Rembrandt produced a luminous and highly evocative portrait of his young wife in the guise of Flora, the Roman goddess of spring and fertility. Now housed in the Hermitage Museum, this canvas stands at the intersection of personal affection, mythological allusion, and the broader Dutch tradition of allegorical portraiture. At first glance, the painting seems to partake in a long-standing Renaissance convention of depicting sitters as classical deities. Yet, unlike the idealized goddesses of Italian or Flemish precedent, Saskia retains her recognizable features, grounding the allegory in intimate portraiture. Her expression is gentle and contemplative, her gaze averted from the viewer, which introduces a sense of modesty unusual for mythological representations. This tension between public allegory and private intimacy is central to the painting's power. The choice of Flora is particularly telling. As goddess of flowers, gardens, and fertility, Flora embodied themes of renewal, fecundity, and natural abundance. By casting Saskia in this role, Rembrandt not only celebrated her youth and beauty, but also alluded to their newly forged union, with its promise of marital prosperity and progeny. The symbolism acquires a biographical resonance. Saskia would give birth to several children, though only one survived into adulthood, and the theme of fertility thus carried poignant undertones for the couple. Rembrandt's handling of costume and texture contributes significantly to the painting's allegorical aura. Saskia is enveloped in a voluminous gown of golden hues, enriched with delicate folds that shimmer under a subtle play of light. Her head is adorned with a garland of flowers, some meticulously rendered to suggest specific seasonal blooms. The staff she carries, twined with blossoms, further anchors her identity as Flora. These floral elements are not mere decorative motifs, but carefully calibrated symbols of life, abundance, and the cycles of nature. From a stylistic perspective, Flora demonstrates Rembrandt's assimilation of Venetian colorism and his departure from the tighter, linear style of his Leiden years. The soft transitions of light, the warm tonalities, and the palpable materiality of fabrics and flowers all attest to his increasing command of painterly richness. At the same time, the psychological depth that characterizes Rembrandt's mature portraits already emerges. Saskia is not simply adorned as Flora, but inhabits the role with a quiet dignity and introspection that transcends costume. Placed within the broader context of Dutch portraiture, Flora is unusual. Whereas Dutch burghers typically preferred sober realism in their likenesses, allegorical and mythological portraits were comparatively rare, often signaling humanist learning or aristocratic aspiration. Rembrandt's decision to depict his wife in such guise thus reflects both his ambition as an artist and his desire to elevate Saskia, herself from a patrician Frisian family, into a sphere of timeless and idealized beauty. Ultimately, Flora, Saskia as Flora, is more than an allegorical conceit. It is a tender testament to the intimacy of Rembrandt's early marriage, an image where personal affection and artistic innovation converge. By merging the recognizable individuality of Saskia with the timeless symbolism of Flora, Rembrandt constructs a portrait that is simultaneously private and public, mortal and mythological. A work that exemplifies his ability to transform lived experience into enduring art. Rembrandt's Judith at the Banquet of Holofernes, 1634, housed in the Museo del Prado in Madrid, occupies a curious place in his oeuvre. Signed Rembrandt F. 1634, the painting was long misidentified as Artemisia receiving Mausolus's ashes, or Sophonisba, receiving the poisoned cup due to its lavish depiction of a richly adorned woman accepting a chalice from her attendant. Only in more recent scholarship has the subject been convincingly identified as Judith, the Jewish widow who seduced and decapitated the Assyrian general Holofernes to save her people, a story recounted in the deuterocanonical Book of Judith. At the heart of the painting lies its deliberate ambiguity. For centuries, viewers were unsure whether the heroine was Artemisia, mourning her husband Mausolus by drinking his ashes, Sophonisba, the Carthaginian noblewoman who chose suicide to avoid Roman captivity, or a generalized queenly figure. This confusion stems from Rembrandt's avoidance of overt iconographic cues. Unlike other artists who often emphasize Judith's sword or Holofernes' severed head, Rembrandt situates the narrative at the banquet, heightening the psychological tension before the climactic act of violence. The result is an image that oscillates between regal portraiture, allegory, and biblical drama. Central to the composition is the heroine herself, who radiates dignity and composure. Seated, adorned in sumptuous garments and glittering jewels, she gazes downward with restraint, her expression caught between solemnity and resolve. Her poise contrasts with the youthful attendant who offers her the cup, creating a dynamic of authority and service. The splendor of her costume with its gold embroidery, pearls, and diadem evokes the conventions of royal portraiture, elevating Judith into the realm of timeless queenship. For the figure's features, Rembrandt likely drew upon his wife Saskia, infusing the biblical heroine with an intimacy that collapses the boundary between personal likeness and historical narrative. Thematically, the work exemplifies Rembrandt's capacity to foreground the psychological and moral dimensions of biblical heroines. Rather than dwelling on Judith's violent triumph, he captures her in a moment of interiority, poised at the threshold of decisive action. In this respect, the painting resonates with the broader 17th century fascination with female virtue, courage, and sacrifice, themes also explored in depictions of figures like Esther and Jael. The opulent treatment of costume and texture further underscores Rembrandt's painterly ambitions at this stage of his career. The gleaming fabrics, the sparkle of jewels, and the play of light across surfaces all testify to his assimilation of Flemish influences, particularly from Rubens, while simultaneously demonstrating his unique interest in psychological realism. Unlike Rubens's exuberant mythological heroines, however, Rembrandt's Judith is more restrained, her grandeur tempered by introspection. The painting also functions as an experiment in narrative condensation. By stripping away explicit violence and focusing on the banquet scene, Rembrandt compels the viewer to consider Judith's moral courage rather than her physical act. This narrative subtlety aligns with his broader artistic trajectory, where the unseen, implied, or interior often carries greater weight than overt spectacle. Judith at the Banquet of Holofernes encapsulates Rembrandt's ability to merge portraiture, biblical narrative, and allegorical grandeur into a single image of enduring complexity. Long misunderstood due to its iconographic subtlety, the painting today stands as a testament to his exploration of feminine heroism, psychological depth, and painterly splendor. By possibly modeling Judith on Saskia, Rembrandt fused the personal with the historical, creating an image that is at once intimate and monumental, private and universal. Rembrandt van Rijn's Descent from the Cross, 1634, now housed in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, stands as one of the most powerful and emotionally charged examples of his religious art. Executed in oil on canvas, this work belongs to a long tradition of depictions of Christ's removal from the cross, a subject treated by countless masters before him. Yet Rembrandt's version is distinguished by its psychological intensity, complex figural arrangement, and extraordinary manipulation of light and shadow. Beyond its artistic qualities, the painting also acquires historical significance through both its religious context in 17th century Holland and its precarious preservation during the Second World War. At first glance, the composition appears crowded, filled with figures clustered around the central action. Yet Rembrandt masterfully organizes this density into a coherent drama, balancing expressive variety with compositional unity. Each individual is given a distinct role, their faces and gestures articulating varying degrees of grief, shock, or solemn restraint. The women in particular embody overt emotional display, their weeping and lamentations made visible through flowing gestures and anguished expressions. By contrast, the men are depicted with a quieter gravity, their grief internalized, manifesting in tightly held features and tense bodily stances. This duality of mourning, the externalized sorrow of women and the stoic silence of men, echoes traditional gendered codes of 17th century devotional imagery, while also amplifying the emotional range of the scene. The figure of Mary is especially poignant. Overwhelmed by despair, she collapses in unconsciousness, supported both physically and emotionally by those around her. Her swoon mirrors Christ's descent, linking the suffering of mother and son in a visual parallel that underscores the human cost of divine sacrifice. At the center of the composition, the lifeless body of Christ is rendered with uncompromising realism. His twisted torso, limp arms, and slumped head convey the inert weight of death. Rembrandt's treatment of Christ's body, rounded, fleshy, and almost Rubenesque, suggests an engagement with the Flemish tradition, particularly Rubens, whose voluptuous figures were widely admired and emulated in the Dutch Republic. Visible are the marks of suffering, the wounds from the crown of thorns and the stigmata in hands and feet, reminders of his passion. Equally striking is the painting's use of light. The event takes place at night, with illumination provided by a network of torches and candles, each casting a different degree of glow. This creates a complex interplay of highlights and shadows, producing an almost theatrical sense of stage lighting. The brightest illumination falls upon Christ's body, marking it unequivocally as the focal point of the composition. From there, light extends to three secondary groupings: the men lowering Christ from the cross, the women preparing burial cloths, and Mary collapsing into the arms of her companions. This distribution of light creates a narrative rhythm. What has occurred, the crucifixion; what is about to occur, the burial; and the emotional consequence of these events, human grief. Through light alone, Rembrandt provides both visual clarity and theological meditation, inviting viewers to move beyond spectacle into contemplation. The work also gains significance when placed within its broader historical and religious context. Rembrandt was not formally affiliated with any church, though his parents came from different traditions, his mother a Catholic, his father a member of the Dutch Reformed Church. In the 17th century, the Netherlands was undergoing intense religious transformation as the Protestant Reformation reshaped cultural life, and the Catholic Counter-Reformation sought to reassert its influence. The descent from the cross belongs to both traditions. It was a devotional image for Catholics and simultaneously a theologically resonant scene for Protestants. By focusing on Christ's suffering and the emotional weight of human witness, Rembrandt transcended confessional boundaries, creating an image that could resonate with viewers across a divided religious landscape. The later history of the painting adds yet another layer of resonance. During the Second World War, as Leningrad, modern St. Petersburg, came under siege, the Hermitage faced the imminent threat of destruction. Masterpieces, including Rembrandt's Descent from the Cross, were carefully removed from their frames and hidden in reinforced vaults and cellars. Some works too fragile to transport were left behind, vulnerable to bombing. After the siege was lifted, the Hermitage was restored and reopened in 1945, with Rembrandt's work returned to public view. The painting thus survived not only the turmoil of 17th century religious strife, but also the devastation of modern warfare, reinforcing its status as a witness to human endurance and cultural resilience. Rembrandt's Descent from the Cross exemplifies his mastery of narrative, composition, and light, while also embodying the intersection of art, faith, and history. Through its emotionally nuanced figures, strategic illumination, and poignant realism, the painting transcends its subject matter to become a meditation on grief, sacrifice, and human frailty. Its survival through centuries of religious upheaval and wartime peril makes it not only a testament to Rembrandt's genius, but also a symbol of the endurance of art itself. Minerva, 1635, an oil-on-canvas painting now held in a Canadian private collection, represents one of the artist's rare forays into the world of classical mythology. Unlike the biblical narratives and portrait commissions that dominate his oeuvre, Minerva positions Rembrandt within the intellectual and cultural dialogues of 17th century Europe, in which the humanist revival of antiquity informed art, literature, and philosophy. The painting, while steeped in mythological subject matter, is at once a work of portraiture, allegory, and history painting, embodying the versatility and ambition of the young Rembrandt at a pivotal stage in his career. The subject of the work, Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom, strategy, and the arts, was a figure of immense symbolic weight in early modern Europe. She was associated not only with the classical virtues of knowledge and prudence, but also with the protection of civic and scholarly pursuits. In depicting Minerva, Rembrandt aligns himself with a long lineage of Renaissance and Baroque artists who elevated the goddess as a symbol of human intellect and moral strength. Yet unlike the idealized and often overtly heroic depictions by Italian and Flemish masters, Rembrandt renders her with striking psychological depth. She is presented not as a distant allegory, but as a tangible, almost portrait-like presence, immersed in quiet thought rather than grandiose display. The composition situates Minerva in an interior space rather than a mythological setting, a decision that grounds the goddess in a humanized, contemplative environment. She is adorned with a rich, elaborately detailed gown, a helmet, and the attributes traditionally associated with her role, yet Rembrandt's emphasis falls less on her martial power and more on her intellectual gravitas. The light, carefully manipulated to highlight her face and upper body, creates an aura of solemn dignity. Her expression is calm and reflective, inviting the viewer to consider wisdom not as an abstract principle, but as a lived and deeply personal virtue. In this way, Rembrandt departs from Rubens's flamboyant mythological allegories and instead develops an image closer to his portraits, where individuality and inner life dominate the visual narrative. The painting also occupies a significant place within Rembrandt's exploration of costume and texture, showcasing his virtuosity in rendering fabrics, metallic sheen, and flesh tones. The meticulous attention to detail, the shimmer of silk, the glint of Minerva's helmet, the luminous softness of her skin, demonstrates Rembrandt's technical mastery at this relatively early stage in his career. Such painterly richness aligns the work with the broader Baroque fascination with sensory immediacy and dramatic presence, while simultaneously emphasizing the thematic tension between worldly opulence and the spiritual or intellectual pursuits symbolized by Minerva. Beyond its artistic qualities, the history of Minerva's ownership underscores its value and prestige across centuries. From its early possession by James Somerville, 12th Lord Somerville of Edinburgh, through the collections of prominent dealers, financiers, and industrialists, including the Duvain brothers, Jules Bache, Marcel Nemes, Axel Lennart Wenner-Gren, Antenor Patino, and Marcel Beach, the paintings circulated among some of the most influential figures in 20th century collecting. Its exhibition in the Bridgestone Museum of Art in Tokyo from 1988 to 2011 further reflects the globalization of old master collecting, as masterpieces of the European canon found new audiences in Asia. This rich provenance not only affirms the painting's authenticity and desirability, but also situates it as an object of cultural capital, embodying the shifting patterns of art ownership in modern history. Minerva demonstrates the artist's ability to adapt classical iconography to his distinctive artistic vision. By transforming the goddess of wisdom into a figure of introspective humanity, Rembrandt created an image that bridges allegory and portraiture, myth and reality. The painting's luminous textures, psychological depth, and layered symbolism make it a vital part of his early oeuvre. Moreover, its storied provenance stretching from 17th century Scotland to 21st century Canada underscores its enduring resonance as both a work of art and a cultural artifact. Ultimately, Minerva reveals Rembrandt's fascination with the human face of wisdom, presenting a goddess not as an untouchable deity but as a contemplative figure, radiant with both intellectual and painterly brilliance. Belshazzar's Feast, now housed in the National Gallery, London, stands as one of the most dramatic and monumental works of his career. Painted between 1635 and 1638, the canvas represents Rembrandt's ambitious attempt to establish himself as a painter of large-scale Baroque history paintings, placing him in dialogue with contemporaries such as Rubens and Van Dyck. Drawing upon the Old Testament story of Belshazzar from the Book of Daniel, chapter 5, the painting is at once a biblical illustration, a theatrical spectacle, and an exercise in painterly bravura. The subject matter derives from the account of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, who hosted a lavish banquet in which sacred vessels looted from the temple in Jerusalem were profanely used. During the feast, a mysterious hand appeared and inscribed on the wall the cryptic Aramaic words Mene, Mene, Tekel, Uparsin. Daniel, summoned to interpret the inscription, proclaimed it as a divine judgment foretelling the fall of Belshazzar's kingdom. Rembrandt's painting captures the pivotal moment of terror and revelation. The king recoils in shock, his eyes bulging, his body contorted as the supernatural writing blazes forth against the darkened wall. Visually, Belshazzar's feast exemplifies the grandeur and dynamism of Baroque history painting. The composition is crowded with figures clad in sumptuous robes and glittering jewels, the banquet table overflowing with food and vessels, rendered with Rembrandt's trademark attention to texture and light. Gold, silver, and rich fabrics shimmer under a dramatic chiaroscuro that heightens the sense of immediacy and spectacle. The king's extravagant turban, resplendent with pearls, and the lavish setting reflect not only biblical description, but also the visual language of exotic luxury that appealed to 17th century Dutch audiences. At the same time, Rembrandt's use of light and shadow transforms the scene from a mere feast into a moment of cosmic judgment, as the divine inscription becomes the ultimate focal point. Perhaps most striking is Rembrandt's rendering of the king's psychological state. Unlike Rubens, born to Herman van Rijn, a corn miller, and Cornelia van Zuidbroek, a baker's daughter. The prosperous family lived in Leiden near the Rhine River, originally called the Van Rijn River, and dedicated themselves to religion and education. Cornelia often read the scriptures to her children, which provided a strong sense of God, man, and nature for the young and profoundly Christian Rembrandt. Rembrandt's parents recognized his talents as a young child, so they sent him, from age 7 to 14, to the Latin school in Leiden for a classical education. He received the best education that an academic city in Holland could provide for a child with a deep interest in literature and scripture. He was duly prepared for admission to the University of Leiden, a fine institution. He entered the university as Rembrandtus Hermanni Leidenis and signed early paintings as RHL, but after a few months he withdrew to dedicate himself to art. Rembrandt secured a 3-year apprenticeship with Jacob Swanenberg, who taught him the fundamentals of painting, drawing, and etching. When he was still in his teens, his father sent him to Amsterdam to study with Peter Lastman, a skilled Italian painter of historical scenes. Lastman had studied the works of Caravaggio and Eisheimer, a German painter living in Rome. After several months, Rembrandt had mastered the techniques of chiaroscuro as well as the use of bright, glossy colors and posing figures with theatrical gestures. Lastman also influenced Rembrandt to concentrate on historical and religious scenes, although the local art buyers preferred scenes from their daily lives. As Paul Nemo quoted in his 1975 Rembrandt drawings, the young Rembrandt felt strongly about his subjects, saying, "Painting is the grandchild of nature. It is related to God." At the age of 18 or 19, Rembrandt returned to Leiden to set up his own studio. He looked more refined, dressed well, and worked closely with a student 6 years younger, Jan Lievens, who had also studied under Lastman. Rembrandt began his artistic journey with a remarkable display of talent and originality. Among his earliest known surviving works is The Senses, a series of 5 oil paintings created around 1624 or 1625, when the artist was only about 18 or 19 years old. This series, comprising allegorical depictions of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, not only reveals Rembrandt's emerging technical skills, but also offers an early glimpse into his lifelong fascination with the human condition, emotion, and realism. Each painting in The Senses represents one of the 5 human faculties through vivid genre scenes rather than abstract personifications. The titles assigned to the works in modern scholarship are A Peddler Selling Spectacles, Sight; Three Singers, Hearing; Unconscious Patient, Allegory of Smell; The Operation, Allegory of Touch; and a now-lost work presumed to have depicted taste. Despite their small scale and youthful execution, these paintings demonstrate the young Rembrandt's developing mastery in composition, character portrayal, and psychological nuance. In A Peddler Selling Spectacles, a man attempts to place eyeglasses onto an elderly woman, symbolizing the restoration or perhaps imposition of vision. The gesture may suggest a broader allegory, the idea of seeing clearly as a metaphor for wisdom or enlightenment. Meanwhile, Three Singers presents a group of expressive figures mid-song, their animated faces and open mouths capturing the auditory experience of music and the social nature of hearing. Unconscious Patient, also known as the Allegory of Smell, is perhaps the most dynamic and dramatic of the group. It depicts a man being revived with smelling salts, his unconscious state broken by the pungent stimulant. The scene is visceral and immediate, emphasizing smell as a physical, almost violent sensory force. Similarly, The Operation, representing touch, shows a medical procedure being performed a moment both intimate and uncomfortable, grounding the sense of touch in pain, precision, and corporeal reality. Though the painting for taste is now lost, scholars have speculated about its content based on the thematic consistency of the others. It likely featured a scene involving eating or drinking, rendered with the same earthy realism that characterizes the rest of the series. Stylistically, these works prefigure many of Rembrandt's mature characteristics. While the lighting is relatively even compared to his later dramatic Chiaroscuro, the focus on facial expression, human interaction, and narrative clarity is already present. The compositions are simple but effective, often centering the action closely and eliminating distractions. This approach reflects Rembrandt's early interest in Troni's studies of expressive faces that would continue throughout his career. Moreover, the Senses series provides valuable insight into the cultural and artistic environment of early 17th century Leiden. Genre scenes and allegorical subjects were popular among middle-class Dutch patrons, who favored art that was relatable and morally instructive. Rembrandt's choice to render the senses through common folk rather than mythological or idealized figures aligns with this preference and reveals his ability to respond to market demand without compromising creative vision. The Senses stands as a crucial milestone in Rembrandt's artistic development. These paintings, though created at the dawn of his career, already contain the seeds of his future greatness, a sensitivity to human emotion, a commitment to realism, and a boldness in concept. They mark the awakening of a genius whose work would forever change the course of Western art. The stoning of St. Stephen marks the official beginning of Rembrandt van Rijn's artistic career. Completed in 1625, when the Dutch painter was only 19 years old, it is widely regarded as his first signed work, and it offers a compelling glimpse into the genius that would later define one of the most influential painters in Western art. Executed in oil on a wooden panel and currently housed in the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Lyon, the painting represents both a religious meditation and a technical exercise. Drawing inspiration from biblical text, contemporary art influences, and Rembrandt's emerging visual language. This work is inspired by the martyrdom of Saint Stephen, the first Christian martyr as recounted in Acts 7:54-60. A young deacon in the early Christian community of Jerusalem, Stephen was condemned to death by stoning after being accused of blasphemy. Rembrandt chose to represent the precise moment when Stephen, dragged outside the city by his accusers, is being stoned by a crowd of roughly 20 figures. As he suffers the assault, Stephen utters his final words to Christ, and Rembrandt dramatizes this divine communication through a striking use of light. A celestial radiance surrounds the martyr, suggesting the heavens have opened above him. The scene encapsulates the tension between earthly brutality and spiritual transcendence, a dichotomy that would preoccupy Rembrandt throughout his career. The composition reflects the young artist's awareness of contemporary artistic influences, particularly the dramatic realism of Caravaggio and the refined narrative clarity of Adam Elsheimer. These influences are visible in both the painting's structure and its lighting. The scene is divided into two distinct zones, separated by a diagonal composition that creates a strong chiaroscuro effect. On the left, a man on horseback is cloaked in shadow, while on the right, St. Stephen and his assailants are bathed in bright light. This interplay between darkness and illumination not only guides the viewer's eye, but also reinforces the spiritual symbolism at the heart of the work. The light surrounding Stephen affirms his sanctity and links the physical violence of martyrdom with the promise of divine salvation. In the background sits Saul of Tarsus, later known as St. Paul, calmly observing the execution while holding the garments of the stoners. This faithful biblical detail is layered into the narrative, emphasizing both the historical moment and the transformative journey Saul would eventually undergo. While the composition is ambitious, it also reveals signs of Rembrandt's youth. Drawing inaccuracies are visible in certain areas, including some distortions in anatomy and perspective. Born to Herman van Rijn, a corn miller, and Cornelia van Zuidbroek, a baker's daughter. The prosperous family lived in Leiden near the Rhine River, originally called the Van Rijn River, and dedicated themselves to religion and education. Cornelia often read the scriptures to her children, which provided a strong sense of God, man, and nature for the young and profoundly Christian Rembrandt. Rembrandt's parents recognized his talents as a young child, so they sent him, from age 7 to 14, to the Latin school in Leiden for a classical education. He received the best education that an academic city in Holland could provide for a child with a deep interest in literature and scripture. He was duly prepared for admission to the University of Leiden, a fine institution. He entered the university as Rembrandtus Hermanni Leidenis and signed early paintings as RHL, but after a few months he withdrew to dedicate himself to art. Rembrandt secured a 3-year apprenticeship with Jacob Swanenberg, who taught him the fundamentals of painting, drawing, and etching. When he was still in his teens, his father sent him to Amsterdam to study with Peter Lastman, a skilled Italian painter of historical scenes. Lastman had studied the works of Caravaggio and Eisheimer, a German painter living in Rome. After several months, Rembrandt had mastered the techniques of chiaroscuro as well as the use of bright, glossy colors and posing figures with theatrical gestures. Lastman also influenced Rembrandt to concentrate on historical and religious scenes, although the local art buyers preferred scenes from their daily lives. As Paul Nemo quoted in his 1975 Rembrandt drawings, the young Rembrandt felt strongly about his subjects, saying, "Painting is the grandchild of nature. It is related to God." At the age of 18 or 19, Rembrandt returned to Leiden to set up his own studio. He looked more refined, dressed well, and worked closely with a student 6 years younger, Jan Lievens, who had also studied under Lastman. Rembrandt began his artistic journey with a remarkable display of talent and originality. Among his earliest known surviving works is The Senses, a series of 5 oil paintings created around 1624 or 1625, when the artist was only about 18 or 19 years old. This series, comprising allegorical depictions of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, not only reveals Rembrandt's emerging technical skills, but also offers an early glimpse into his lifelong fascination with the human condition, emotion, and realism. Each painting in The Senses represents one of the 5 human faculties through vivid genre scenes rather than abstract personifications. The titles assigned to the works in modern scholarship are A Peddler Selling Spectacles, Sight, 3 Singers, Hearing, Unconscious Patient, Allegory of Smell, The Operation, Allegory of Touch, and a now-lost work presumed to have depicted taste. Despite their small-scale and youthful execution, these paintings demonstrate the young Rembrandt's developing mastery in composition, character portrayal, and psychological nuance. In A Peddler Selling Spectacles, a man attempts to place eyeglasses onto an elderly woman, symbolizing the restoration or perhaps imposition of vision. The gesture may suggest a broader allegory, the idea of seeing clearly as a metaphor for wisdom or enlightenment. Meanwhile, Three Singers presents a group of expressive figures mid-song, their animated faces and open mouths capturing the auditory experience of music and the social nature of hearing. Unconscious Patient, also known as the Allegory of Smell, is perhaps the most dynamic and dramatic of the group. It depicts a man being revived with smelling salts, his unconscious state broken by the pungent stimulant. The scene is visceral and immediate, emphasizing smell as a physical, almost violent sensory force. Similarly, The Operation, representing touch, shows a medical procedure being performed a moment both intimate and uncomfortable, grounding the sense of touch in pain, precision, and corporeal reality. Though the painting for taste is now lost, Scholars have speculated about its content based on the thematic consistency of the others. It likely featured a scene involving eating or drinking, rendered with the same earthy realism that characterizes the rest of the series. Stylistically, these works prefigure many of Rembrandt's mature characteristics. While the lighting is relatively even compared to his later dramatic Chiaroscuro, the focus on facial expression, human interaction, and narrative clarity is already present. The compositions are simple but effective, often centering the action closely and eliminating distractions. This approach reflects Rembrandt's early interest in Troni's studies of expressive faces that would continue throughout his career. Moreover, the Senses series provides valuable insight into the cultural and artistic environment of early 17th century Leiden. Genre scenes and allegorical subjects were popular among middle-class Dutch patrons, who favored art that was relatable and morally instructive. Rembrandt's choice to render the senses through common folk rather than mythological or idealized figures aligns with this preference and reveals his ability to respond to market demand without compromising creative vision. The Senses stands as a crucial milestone in Rembrandt's artistic development. These paintings, though created at the dawn of his career, already contain the seeds of his future greatness: a sensitivity to human emotion, a commitment to realism, and a boldness in concept. They mark the awakening of a genius whose work would forever change the course of Western art. The stoning of St. Stephen marks the official beginning of Rembrandt van Rijn's artistic career. Completed in 1625, when the Dutch painter was only 19 years old, it is widely regarded as his first signed work, and it offers a compelling glimpse into the genius that would later define one of the most influential painters in Western art. Executed in oil on a wooden panel and currently housed in the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Lyon, the painting represents both a religious meditation and a technical exercise. Drawing inspiration from biblical text, contemporary art influences, and Rembrandt's emerging visual language. This work is inspired by the martyrdom of Saint Stephen, the first Christian martyr as recounted in Acts 7:54-60. A young deacon in the early Christian community of Jerusalem, Stephen was condemned to death by stoning after being accused of blasphemy. Rembrandt chose to represent the precise moment when Stephen, dragged outside the city by his accusers, is being stoned by a crowd of roughly 20 figures. As he suffers the assault, Stephen utters his final words to Christ, and Rembrandt dramatizes this divine communication through a striking use of light. A celestial radiance surrounds the martyr, suggesting the heavens have opened above him. The scene encapsulates the tension between earthly brutality and spiritual transcendence, a dichotomy that would preoccupy Rembrandt throughout his career. The composition reflects the young artist's awareness of contemporary artistic influences, particularly the dramatic realism of Caravaggio and the refined narrative clarity of Adam Elsheimer. These influences are visible in both the painting's structure and its lighting. The scene is divided into two distinct zones, separated by a diagonal composition that creates a strong chiaroscuro effect. On the left, a man on horseback is cloaked in shadow, while on the right, St. Stephen and his assailants are bathed in bright light. This interplay between darkness and illumination not only guides the viewer's eye, but also reinforces the spiritual symbolism at the heart of the work. The light surrounding Stephen affirms his sanctity and links the physical violence of martyrdom with the promise of divine salvation. In the background sits Saul of Tarsus, later known as St. Paul, calmly observing the execution while holding the garments of the stoners. This faithful biblical detail is layered into the narrative, emphasizing both the historical moment and the transformative journey Saul would eventually undergo. While the composition is ambitious, it also reveals signs of Rembrandt's youth. Drawing inaccuracies are visible in certain areas, including some distortions in anatomy and perspective. However, these technical imperfections are overshadowed by the painting's emotional intensity and narrative complexity. A particularly notable element of the painting is Rembrandt's early exploration of self-portraiture. Scholars have identified up to 7 variations of his own face embedded within the crowd of figures, an unusually introspective choice for such a young artist. One figure, located just behind Stephen, appears to be a self-portrait, rendered within the larger composition, much like Diego Velázquez would later do in Las Meninas. Biblical scholar John Durham suggests that Rembrandt presents himself here as a somewhat alarmed presence, a participant who may be having second thoughts about what was taking place. This interpretation positions the artist not merely as an observer, but as a moral witness, uncertain of his role in the unfolding violence. By inserting himself into the scene multiple times, Rembrandt confronts the ethical weight of martyrdom and human cruelty, suggesting a profound personal engagement with the subject. Stylistically, the stoning of St. Stephen showcases many of the themes and methods that would become central to Rembrandt's later work. His use of expressive facial detail, dramatic lighting, and theatrical composition all point to an evolving mastery of visual storytelling. More importantly, the painting highlights his preoccupation with the psychological and spiritual dimensions of his subjects, a trait that would come to define his mature religious works. The stoning of St. Stephen is far more than a student exercise or early experiment. It is a deeply ambitious, emotionally charged work that marks the beginning of Rembrandt's career with powerful themes of faith, violence, moral conflict, and divine grace. Drawing on the artistic traditions of Caravaggio and Elsheimer while laying the groundwork for his own unique voice, Rembrandt used this biblical narrative not only to showcase his emerging skills, but also to insert himself both literally and spiritually into the great moral and existential questions of his time. Among the earliest religious paintings attributed to Rembrandt van Rijn, Let the Little Children Come to Me, also known as Suffer the Little Children to Come Unto Me, stands out as a poignant reflection on divine compassion and human innocence. Believed to have been painted in Leiden during the 1620s, this work reflects Rembrandt's formative years, when he was still developing his technical vocabulary and narrative style. Though the attribution remains debated, the painting reveals many characteristics of the young Rembrandt's vision, particularly his psychological sensitivity, narrative clarity, and deep moral imagination. The painting is inspired by a passage from the Gospel of Mark 10:13-16, in which Jesus, when the disciples attempt to turn children away, commands, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these." This scene affirms the spiritual value of innocence and childlike trust. Rembrandt, or the artist to whom this work is attributed, renders this moment not as a lofty, celestial event, but as a scene grounded in human warmth and accessibility. Christ is typically depicted seated at the center, extending a blessing to a group of small children, while mothers, followers, and onlookers gather around. The emotional core of the painting lies not in grandeur, but in tender interaction. A child reaching out, a mother offering her infant, Jesus welcoming them with gentle eyes and outstretched hands. The theological message is translated into visual language that invites empathy. The painting's composition is intimate and compact, with closely grouped figures filling the frame. This choice not only reflects Rembrandt's early style during his Leiden period, but also enhances the sense of emotional closeness. The lighting is soft and warm, lacking the bold chiaroscuro of his later works, but still subtly guiding the viewer's eye toward the central figure of Christ and the children. The palette leans toward earthy tones, reinforcing the naturalism that would later become one of Rembrandt's trademarks. One of the distinctive traits of this painting, if it is indeed by Rembrandt, is its genre-like realism. The figures are dressed in contemporary 17th century clothing, grounding the sacred story within familiar, everyday imagery. This technique aligns with the Protestant artistic culture of the Dutch Republic, which favored personal piety and accessible representations of biblical scenes over grandiose iconography. Even in this early phase, the artist displays a remarkable command of emotional nuance. Jesus is not portrayed as an aloof divine authority, but rather as a deeply human presence kind, approachable, attentive. His facial expression exudes empathy, while the varied reactions of the surrounding figures' curiosity, reverence, hesitation add to the painting's psychological complexity. This attention to human emotion is one of the defining characteristics of Rembrandt's oeuvre. In works such as The Return of the Prodigal Son or The Raising of Lazarus, he would later explore the full spectrum of spiritual and emotional transformation. Let the Little Children Come to Me appears to anticipate this trajectory, revealing a young artist already attuned to the inner lives of his subjects. Painted during the artist's early Leiden years, this work shows clear evidence of influence from his teacher Peter Lastman, especially in the narrative organization and classical posturing of some figures. Yet it also departs from Lastman's more theatrical style in favor of greater emotional realism and restraint. Furthermore, the painting's theme, Christ embracing society's most vulnerable, aligns with one of Rembrandt's lifelong concerns: the dignity of the marginalized. In later decades, he would return to similar subjects, beggars, elderly people, or biblical figures in moments of weakness or grace. In that sense, Let the Little Children Come to Me serves as a quiet thematic foundation for much of what was to come. Though some scholars question whether the painting is truly by Rembrandt, others point to its stylistic affinities, particularly in facial modeling and composition, as evidence of his hand. If not by Rembrandt himself, it likely emerged from his close circle, reflecting shared values and approaches in early 17th century Dutch religious art. Let the Little Children Come to Me is a work of subtle power and enduring relevance. Whether definitively by Rembrandt or not, the painting embodies the values he would later champion: intimacy, empathy, and spiritual humanity. It turns a moment of scripture into a scene of everyday grace, where divine love is made visible through human gesture and connection. As such, it marks an important step in the evolution of one of the most compassionate and perceptive artists in the history of Western painting. History painting, completed in 1626, is one of Rembrandt's earliest known works, executed when he was just 20 years old. Painted in Leiden, the work reflects the young artist's early ambition to position himself among the most intellectually and artistically elite genres of painting, that of history painting, which in the hierarchy of genres stood above landscape, portraiture, and still life due to its moral, narrative, and often spiritual gravitas. Yet the very title of this work, history painting, reveals a fundamental mystery. The subject matter remains unidentified, and art historians have long debated what scene the young Rembrandt intended to portray. Over a dozen hypotheses have been proposed, ranging from biblical episodes to classical antiquity and modern history. According to the art historian Gary Schwartz, one of the most compelling interpretations is Palamedes before Agamemnon, a tragic scene from the Trojan War. In this story, Palamedes is falsely accused of treason by Odysseus, and Agamemnon, persuaded by forged evidence, orders him executed by stoning. If this interpretation is correct, the painting can be read as a powerful exploration of injustice, political intrigue, and the fragility of truth. These themes would later reappear in Rembrandt's mature biblical works, indicating a thematic through line from his early career. The dramatic intensity of the scene, with figures captured mid-motion and faces contorted in tension or grief, demonstrates Rembrandt's budding skill in drama, narrative composition, and emotional realism. Visually, the painting is notable for its dense grouping of figures and complex theatrical staging, a feature influenced by the contemporaneous work of Caravaggio and Adam Elsheimer. The use of chiaroscuro, though not yet as refined as in his later masterpieces, is already evident. Light focuses on the central figures, casting moral and visual weight upon them, while the periphery recedes into shadow. This technique not only adds depth and movement, but also guides the viewer's gaze and emotional engagement with the scene. Another noteworthy element is Rembrandt's use of costume and gesture, which reflects a deliberate attempt to evoke antiquity without relying on archaeological accuracy. The clothing is eclectic, blending elements from Renaissance, classical, and even contemporary Dutch fashion, a typical feature of early 17th century history painting that prioritized dramatic effect over historical precision. Although some technical inconsistencies remain, such as in anatomy and spatial coherence, they are understandable for a work completed during Rembrandt's formative years. What stands out is his boldness in tackling a large, multi-figure narrative composition, a sign of his aspiration to rival the great masters of his time. History painting is less about a single confirmed story and more about Rembrandt's first major engagement with storytelling through paint. The ambiguity of its subject challenges viewers to engage not only with what